Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, Cabbage_head fanfics. Back with amazing fanfiction. This is the fourth part of What If Deku Had Inheritance Quirk. Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. By the time they got back to the dorms, Kaken was in a foul mood. Izuku understood, because it was frustrating to be that close to a known criminal that they had personally been affected by and not been allowed to engage with. He also understood that it had been far too dangerous for that sort of engagement. He'd had no quick snuff on him, and a quirk that powerful could have caused a lot of collateral damage and even loss of life for anyone nearby. Having heroes better equipped for surveillance and stealth handling the situation could lead to a much larger payoff in the long run. Maybe when Izuku went back to the agency tomorrow, he'd learn more and be allowed to have some sort of role in whatever was decided was the best course of action. What's with him? Kaminari asked when Kaken stormed through, slamming the front door behind him. Izuku filled them in on spotting Dabi and having to leave it alone. Kaminari winced in sympathy. Yaoyorozu was curled up in an armchair nearby with a book in her lap and nodded. "You did the right thing," she said. "That could have been a disaster if you'd gone after him. Did anything else happen while you were out?" Kaminari wanted to know. "I spotted an albino Dalmatian," Izuku answered. "It was the least I could do for it." Kaminari looked confused, but Yaoyorozu rewarded him with a musical laugh that had others around the television looking their way. This led to a silly session of everyone telling their worst jokes, some of which Izuku made a mental note to slip into his conversations with Sir at some point. Kaken didn't make an appearance when it was time for dinner to be started, so Izuku headed into the kitchen. Others lent a hand, and a day that had looked like it was going to end with him feeling frustrated actually ended with him surrounded by friends. The next day, while his classmates were getting ready for class, Izuku was collecting his hero costume and meeting Togata-senpai by the school gates. Ida had promised to take over class rep duties and take notes on everything for him. Togata told him it was best if they didn't discuss anything important having to do with work on the train or in public. Instead, Togata wanted to know more about Izuku and his quirks, and how he'd come to meet All Might and Sir as a kid. Since there didn't seem to be any reason not to tell him, he explained about Granny Ito and All for One, though he left out the bits about his blood and whatever else they had taken from him being used to make the Nomu. Once at the agency, both boys changed into their hero costumes and reported to Sir. "I know you're going to ask about Dabi, so let's get that out of the way first," he said, indicating that they should sit. "We followed him to an alley and watched to see where he would go," Togata said, filling Izuku in. "Obviously we were hoping that he'd lead us to the League of Villains' new hideout, since they vanished after Kamino Ward." "Did he?" Izuku asked. "Not exactly," Togata admitted. "He entered some sort of underground labyrinth. Someone we couldn't identify opened a hidden door and let him in, but when we investigated, we couldn't learn much. Psion could only get flashes from the door, and she's been going through the criminal databases for the area to see if she can find a match for what she saw." At Izuku's confused look, Sir interrupted. "Psion's quirk is psychometry," he explained. "She can tell things about an object's history if she touches it with bare hands." "Right? Sorry," Togata said. "It's really useful in finding missing people, but the door they used didn't seem to have a lot of history, which means it's fairly new. I used my quirk to try to get a look inside, but the hallways had a ton of blind corners and just seemed like a huge maze. We decided it would be easier to wait outside for him to come out, but he never did. So he'd either still be there, or there's another exit," Izuku surmised. Both men nodded in agreement. "Now that we know there's an entrance there, we're keeping more patrols in the area than usual, and we planted a hidden camera that will hopefully shed more light on what's going on there." "So far no one has come or gone from it," Sir said. "Is there anything in particular I should be keeping an eye out for when I'm out on patrol?" Izuku asked. "Yes. There have been a series of attacks on small crime groups and Yakuza in the area," Sir said. "At the heart of them seems to be this man." He turned his computer monitor to show them a picture of a man wearing an ornate, steampunk-inspired plague mask. His eyes were heavy-lidded and sharp, and his dark hair was quite short. In this image, he wore a black shirt with a white tie under an army green jacket with a furry purple collar. An eccentric-looking ensemble, to say the least. His name is Chisaki Kai, but his colleagues call him Overhaul. He's the second in command of a designated villain group called Shai Hasaikai, a remnant from the time where the Yakuza held sway in the underground crime world before Quirks took over. The top players are easily identifiable by the plague doctor masks they all wear. Being a designated villain group means that they're under police scrutiny almost constantly, but I've noticed that his movements have been erratic lately. He seems to be attempting to rebuild his group of followers. Togata agreed. We were hoping that since they've had contact with the League of Villains recently, Dabi might also lead us to Overhaul. Maybe he did, and we just don't have the proof yet. I don't have any proof that he's planning anything illegal, so I can't put out a call for more support from other hero agencies or even the police just yet, but he's a high priority for surveillance. If you see this man, do not engage him in any way. If it's possible to follow him safely from a distance, you're to do that while you call back here for backup. Yes, sir. Izuku agreed. Izuku, it's especially important for you to keep your distance from Chisaki, sir said seriously. The name Overhaul is also the name of his quirk. He can deconstruct and reconstruct anything his hands touch. This includes human beings. CRP, Izuku said, realizing at once what this meant. We don't want you picking up anyone else's quirks if Chisaki decides to use his quirk when you're nearby. Togata's eyes widened at the realization of what they meant. Leave the Shai Hasaikai case to others, sir said calmly. There are plenty of other cases you can keep occupied with. Yes, sir, Izuku agreed. He couldn't help but feel frustrated by the limitations he was already experiencing because of his quirk. This was only his first day of work study and he was already being excluded from some cases. This could end up being a huge problem in the future. Don't let this discourage you, Togata told him, reading his mood. A hero never gives up. Right? Izuku said, appreciating his words. From there, Izuku was assigned to accompany Togata and a sidekick named Twirlin patrol near the docks, where there had been some suspicious activity lately. They didn't have a specific goal, other than for Izuku to become familiar with the area and make sure the public felt safe because of the presence of heroes in the vicinity to handle any problems. Oh, right. Togata said after he introduced Twirl. I don't think we've told each other our hero names. You're Vanguard, right? No, Izuku said sheepishly. I changed it after the licensing exam. It's Gestalt now. Nice. Togata said admiringly. Goes with your quirk. Thanks. You're A million? I heard Sir call you that when you sneak down to our clothes. Togata said, sounding embarrassed as he cut off Izuku's reminder of how they'd first met. Lemillion. That's because I want to save a minimum of 1 million people during my hero career. Twirl had been waiting patiently for them to sort this out, then smiled and offered her hand. I'm Twirl. My quirk lets me spin like a top, which creates a force field around me like a shield that I can use for protection or offense. Cool. Izuku said admiringly. Now that all of the introductions had been made, they set off toward the waterfront. Might Tower was in the Roppongi district, so they took a train for a short trip to the areas near the docks. Even being in costume, they didn't get too much attention on the train, because they were pretty much unknowns. There was a thriving fish market and a couple of greengrocers' stalls, rentals for bikes and fishing equipment as well as the typical shops selling hardware or sundries or convenience items. There were water taxis and tour boats, but no real shipping yards or fishing vessels of any kind. Instead, there were long narrow docks where people could try their hand at casual urban fishing for fun. That's why it was strange to find a bunch of men in suits looking very nervous and furtive as they walked to the end of one of the docks and just stood there, one of them holding an armored briefcase. That doesn't seem suspicious at all, Twirl said dryly. Should we patrol down and see if they get more nervous? Mirio asked, beginning to walk in that direction. Let's watch them for a bit, Twirl said, stepping back behind a magazine kiosk to hide from view. This could be nothing, but we don't want to risk scaring them away. Izuku fished out his phone and began recording video of the men, standing well back, so he wouldn't be in the way. Lemillion had the hardest time seeming inconspicuous, since his costume featured such a bright cape, but stepped behind a colorful display of superhero merchandise that heavily featured All Might. The men waited for a couple of minutes, looking at their phones and watches every few seconds, when a car with dark tinted windows pulled up. Two very large men emerged, also wearing suits, though these men looked less like businessmen and more like bouncers at a host club. The newest arrivals walked to meet the other men, where it didn't seem like many words were exchanged, but briefcases definitely were. The exchange made, the larger men went back to the car and it pulled away from the curb. Should I follow? I can use my levitation and jumps to follow from the rooftops, Izuku asked, eagerly. Twirl looked undecided for a moment before she said, do it. Keep in contact, don't engage. Surveillance only. Izuku didn't wait to hear more and made good on his word. He rose to the roof of the nearest building, then launched himself through the air as he'd seen All Might do hundreds of times. He kept an eye on the vehicle as he went, changing the color of his costume to match the bluish-gray of the sky, so he wouldn't be spotted as easily if anyone looked up. The car didn't seem to be in any hurry, meandering through the city, taking seemingly random turns for almost an hour. His adrenaline was pumping as the thrill of soaring through the air coursed through him. He kept a continual stream of texts going to Lemillion every 3 or 4 minutes that simply kept him apprised of his direction. Eventually, the car turned into an automated parking garage, and Izuku landed on the roof as lightly as he could. He watched the only exit out of the building from his perch on the roof while he texted his location back to Lemillion. A moment later, he got a text from Sir telling him to stay put unless there was a compelling reason to continue following, and that backup would be there shortly. Izuku texted back that he understood and settled down to wait. He could hear the humming and grinding sounds of the garage below him as it operated, and within a couple of minutes, the men he had been following walked out of the exit, but without the briefcase. Strange. He texted this turn of events to both Toga and Sir, and even as he hit send he watched the two men approach a man in front of a Komini almost directly across the street and hand him what looked like car keys. Izuku was careful to hold his breath as he stood and focused his phone's camera on the men, taking pictures of them all as best he could. The men he had initially been following separated at that point and walked off in separate directions. The man they had handed off the keys to strolled into the konbini and came out holding a magazine and a small bag. He lit a cigarette and strolled casually down the sidewalk until he came to a small coffee shop. He crushed out the cigarette and went inside. All 3 men were out of sight at this point, and Izuku was left to wait until his backup arrived. It was only about a half an hour before Lemillion and Twirl arrived, sort of. They contacted Izuku and asked him to meet them about a block away, so anyone watching wouldn't get suspicious of 3 heroes gathering right outside of a location where a suspected criminal had left a suspicious briefcase. Izuku took the rooftops to a small neighborhood park there, where Lemillion and Twirl were indulgently putting up with attention from a handful of children who had spotted heroes in their playground. Another one of the boys shouted excitedly when Izuku arrived. Is something going on? One of the mothers asked worriedly when she saw a 3rd hero. Not at all, ma'am. Lemillion assured her with a winning smile, even as he let 2 kids dangle from his biceps. Gestalt here is a hero in training, out for his very first patrol. Isn't that exciting? Oh, I see, she said, looking relieved. Do your best. Izuku bowed and smiled. I will. Thank you. He was impressed with how smoothly Lemillion dealt with the public, and hoped to be as polished and confident-sounding soon. They extracted themselves from the tangle of kids and moved on. We'll walk back the way you just came, acting as if we're just on a routine patrol. Don't even look at the parking garage as we go by, Twirl told Izuku. Lemillion will use his quirk to gain access and have a look at what's in the briefcase, and meet up with us at the end of the block. Izuku nodded as Lemillion slipped away down an alley. Twirl walked with Izuku down the sidewalk on the opposite side of the street as the parking garage. They waved at shopkeepers and nodded to people they passed, smiling as if they didn't have a care in the world. Izuku helped an elderly man get a 2-wheeled cart of groceries over a tall curb, and Twirl rescued the shoe of a baby in a stroller for its harried mother. Nothing could have been less threatening. When they got to the end of the block, Lemillion was in the narrow space between 2 buildings, looking grim. He was holding the briefcase. We need to go. Now he said. Gestalt, can you find the agency from here? Izuku nodded warily as Lemillion handed him the briefcase. Take this to Sir and don't stop for anything. It's not a bomb or something, right? Izuku asked. It might as well be. We'll be there as fast as we can. Hurry. Izuku nodded and levitated to the roof of the building, using the height to launch himself into the air. From there, it took him some time to reach the agency, but he finally managed it, feeling out of breath and exhilarated as he landed on the roof of Might Tower from the top of another tall building a couple of blocks away. Sir was waiting. Good work, he said, taking the suitcase and leading him back inside. Lemillion and Twirl are currently on the train, but they're safe. What's in there? Izuku asked as Sir examined the briefcase. If Lemillion is correct, it's a cache of quirk enhancers, Sir answered. As soon as we shut down one avenue to smugglers, it seems two more replace it. Within minutes, Sir was being informed that the police had arrived. A detective, a man in plain clothes, and two officers had come to investigate the briefcase as well. The case was opened, and inside was a well-padded, custom-designed interior with 5 vials of a greenish fluid, and several syringes with a tiny amount of the same green in them, ready to be used, each in its own little nest of foam. The man in plain clothes took one of the syringes and dispensed a tiny drop onto a glass slide that he produced from a jacket pocket. His hands were as steady as rocks as he expertly prepared a microscope slide. Instead of a microscope, though, he merely held it up to his eye, using the light from the window to illuminate it. Izuku noticed his eyes dilate to tiny points as he worked. Affirmative, he said at last. These look like especially pure samples too. Twirl and Lemillion arrived as this determination was made and looked relieved that they'd acted prudently. The contents of the cases were photographed before being packed away again. The detective questioned Izuku, Twirl, and Lemillion about everything they saw, and were grateful when Izuku produced video footage and pictures of all of the men involved. After the police left, taking the drags with them, Izuku learned the joys of paperwork and filing reports. He was actually surprised when All Might appeared by the desk Izuku was using to congratulate him on his successful first day. He hadn't realized it had gotten so late, and the hasty bowl of ramen from the agency cafeteria was long since eaten, and Izuku found he was starving. By the time he and Lemillion arrived back to the row of dormitory buildings, it was nearly curfew. Izuku sighed happily as he kicked off his shoes at the door and discovered that his friends had left him a plate covered in plastic wrap from dinner time. He blinked as he saw Kuwaro from next door stuffing a slice of cake into his mouth before vanishing into the shadows. Did he think Izuku didn't see him? He wondered how often the 1B student actually stole their food, but he wasn't too concerned about it, as long as food was the only thing he was taking. He was too tired to think about it for now. It was quiet on the first floor, and Izuku didn't even bother to heat up the pasta before eating it. It had been a good day. The following day, it was Kaken's turn to go to work at Might Tower. Izuku wondered what kind of day he'd have as he joined his classmates for class. Midoriya, how was your first day? Capture any villains? Mina asked him, mostly jokingly as they waited for Aizawa to arrive. No, we did keep some drags off the street, but we never squared off with the guys who were dealing it, Izuku told them honestly. There was a lot of paperwork. Some of the kids chuckled about the paperwork comment, and a couple were interested in the part about the drags, but they lost their immediate opportunity to ask, because class was about to start. Izuku marked Kaken as an excused absence, but was surprised to note that Kirishima, Uraraka, and Tsuyu were also out. Aizawa told everyone that all of the missing students were at their work studies or prospective work studies. Izuku felt bad that he'd been so absorbed in his own life that he didn't even know that his friends had managed to find placements, too. He would have to remember to congratulate them and get the details when they came back. Tomorrow, he would be gone for most of the day again, so he'd have to try to connect with them tonight. It was strange, the way the dynamic of the class changed when 4 people were absent, especially 2 as loud as Kaken and Kirishima. Hero training was still interesting, because Todoroki was working on something Izuku had never seen him try before, actually manipulating his ice to do his bidding. It wasn't going very well, and there was a lot of steam making the room humid as he tried using both his ice and then his fire as a sort of sculpting tool. It seemed like frustrating work, but Todoroki kept a determined expression as he repeated the project again and again. He seemed to be trying to make a simple orb, but wasn't having any luck producing it right off the bat, so was trying to melt the jagged bits. Why a ball? Izuku asked, balancing on his hands and keeping a large cement slab supported on his feet. He was slowly doing push-ups in this position. It seemed the simplest, so I thought it would be a good place to start. Did you get Monoma to copy it and see if he could give you any pointers? Izuku asked with a grunt as he extended his arms. Yeah, he said with a scowl, pausing to look at Izuku. He wasn't much help. He just said that it can be done, but he couldn't explain how. That SCKS, Izuku sympathized. He secretly wondered if Monoma was being deliberately unhelpful so that 1A wouldn't get ahead of 1B. He did seem the type. If it can be done, you'll figure it out, Izuku told him encouragingly. Like when you needed your flame lasso, it just happened because you willed it, right? I hate to admit it, but controlling my fire seems a lot more instinctive to me than manipulating my ice, Todoroki confessed. That sounds frustrating, Izuku said. He now had sweat dripping from his chin, and began to spatter the ground as he strained to keep the concrete slab moving in a steady pace up and down. He'd lost count of the 100 push-ups he'd been aiming for, but his quivering arm muscles told him he was probably past that number. He turned in a slow circle, checking her surroundings to be safe, then pulled his legs in as tight as he could get them before shoving the concrete slab away, sending it hurtling a few meters before crashing down to the ground. The loss of weight almost made Izuku feel like he'd engaged his levitation, and the relief at holding only his own body up was huge. He bent his arms and shoved off the ground, giving his body a boost to get upright. He landed on his feet and reached for his water bottle and towel. There was still some time left until the end of class, so Izuku left Todoroki to concentrate and went to the clear corner by the entrance of the gym to cool down. Mina and Yaoyorozu were working together nearby, with Yaoyorozu endeavoring to produce a substance that Mina couldn't burn through with her acid. Mina was working on producing stronger acid. Izuku sat in a straddle and raised his arms over his head in a simple extension that felt wonderful after being compressed by the weight he'd been working with for the past hour. Demon Midoriya? Mina said, stopping to watch him stretch. You're the most flexible person I know that doesn't have it as part of a quirk. Izuku gave her an embarrassed smile as he twisted his torso and moved into a split. I really enjoyed gymnastics before I had to quit. It comes in handy in hero work. Can you put your feet behind your head? Mina asked. Yes, he said, looking at her strangely. I don't really have a reason to, but I'm able to do it. For real? Sato asked, joining him on the ground to stretch. Sato was not as flexible but had a pretty decent range. Do it now, Mina urged. Do what? Jiro asked, also joining the group. Izuku can put his feet behind his head, Sato said. Her eyebrows arched. Do it, Mina cajoled. Izuku sighed and brought his legs out in front of him, then lifted his left leg and slotted his ankle over the back of his neck. He rolled his eyes when he noticed that Mina and Jiro were both taking pictures or video, no doubt to try to embarrass him with, later. His right leg went up behind his head to join his left. He hammed it up and gave double-handed peace signs, relying on his quirk to keep him from tumbling over. Do I even want to know? Aizawa asked as he appeared from somewhere behind the group. Aoyama, Koda and Ojiro were behind him, looking on with curiosity. Just goofing around, Izuku said with a little embarrassment. Sorry. Everyone hit the showers and get back to class, his teacher said without commenting on the spectacle. Oh, sensei? Izuku called to Aizawa's retreating back. What do you call a large pile of cats? Izuku saw, rather than heard the sigh in the slight droop of the man's shoulders. He didn't turn, but did pause in his walking. A meow. Izuku delivered the punchline with enthusiasm, hoping for some sort of reaction, but Aizawa just began walking away again. His classmates groaned. Dude, that was terrible, Kaminari said, shaking his head. I know, Izuku said with a smile, putting his legs down on the floor. But I heard he likes cats, so I thought I'd try a themed one. I'll have to keep trying. I don't know if he knows how to laugh, to be honest, Sato said seriously. Nah, he's definitely got a sense of humor, Izuku insisted. I just have to find the right angle. As they were approaching the classroom a little while later, Nizu was standing next to Aizawa outside the door, as if waiting for them. Nizu was holding a cell phone that looked more like a tablet in his tiny paws. Midoriya-kun. I was just asking if Aizawa would let me borrow you for a few minutes. I'm afraid I need an interpreter. Of course, Izuku said, looking at Aizawa, who gave him a nod as he herded the others inside. I'd be happy to help. The call turned out to be not particularly interesting for Izuku, but he dutifully stood by on speakerphone with someone speaking Farsi, and relayed what they were saying to Nizu and his replies back. The call didn't take very long, and once Nizu had disconnected, he smiled. It was a little unnerving to see the principal bare his teeth that way. Excellent, excellent, Nizu said to Izuku. After your help here, I have no hesitation to go forward with the offer the Hero Public Safety Commission has put forward for you. Offered, sir? Izuku asked, wondering where this was going. Indeed. They wanted to know if you would be willing to occasionally act as an interpreter for them in events when they don't have one with the skill set for certain matters. They assured me that such instances wouldn't be common, but would be a great help to them. So much so, that they would be willing to compensate you for your time when circumstances called for your assistance. Sure, I guess. I mean, I don't see any reason to say no, Izuku said. Excellent. I believe that they want to provide you with a cell phone that you would be required to keep on your person whenever possible, so you can be reached easily. Other than that, there isn't much to it, Nizu explained. I explained this to your teacher, and he has agreed to excuse you if you're needed during your lessons for any reason. If it begins to become a problem or to hamper your education or training in any way, you can always resign and return the phone. When Izuku went back to class, he was feeling a little bemused, but couldn't think of any huge downside to making a little side money, sanctioned by the Hero Commission and his school. That evening after dinner, he got caught up on Tsuyu, Uraraka and Kirishima's work-study placements. The girls would be going with Hato-senpai to the Ryukyu agency, and they seemed really excited about the opportunity. Kirishima had taken on a position with Fat Gum's agency after pestering Amajiki-senpai into introducing him. Izuku was bemused by the idea of the perpetually extroverted and sunny Kirishima pairing with the severely anxious and introverted Amajiki. Still, it was a position that the others were pretty jealous of. Kaken got home later than anyone, though he claimed nothing interesting had happened beyond routine patrols and a stakeout that was a big waste of time. Izuku's next workday ended up not being overly exciting, though he did get a chance to watch Sir Night Eye spar with Lemillion. Izuku rarely got to see his mentor in action, since he usually ran things behind the scenes, and he observed eagerly as Sir managed not only to dodge every one of Togata-senpai's attacks, but also land several strikes against him. Izuku was amazed by this, but also confused. How do you do that? Izuku asked him once they were finished sparring. Lemillion had been sweaty and tired, while Sir didn't seem to have broken a sweat. It isn't that difficult, Sir said, coming out into the hallway, where Izuku had been watching from. I have my foresight hat tells me where he's going to be at any given moment, even second to second. Yes, but, Izuku said, pinching his lower lip in thought. If you can see where he's going to appear and avoid him, isn't that kind of like changing the probable outcome? How do you mean? Sir asked, motioning for Izuku to follow him as they chatted. Well, if you're seeing where he will be and using that information to avoid being hit, then the probable outcome is supposed to be you being hit, isn't it? The only reason you can dodge him is because you use the information to change the probable outcome, Izuku said. I suppose that's one way of looking at it, Sir said, sounding intrigued by the idea, or at least by Izuku's thought process. Though I also have remarkable deductive reasoning skills and am able to make split-second decisions based on my surroundings and my knowledge of my opponents. My quirk is a tool, just like anyone else's. Izuku said, still considering it. It just seems like a bit of a paradox, if it's impossible to change the future or whatever. I wonder if you've just never been faced with the right set of circumstances before. Izuku shook his head a bit. Things dealing with time and its manipulation in any form were always a headache to try to reason out. Do you think I'll ever be able to win against Togata-senpai in a sparring match? I'm sure you could, Sir told him without hesitation. Look how far Mirio-kun has come in just 3 years. You're just beginning your high school career, while he's ending his. You have a much better grasp and skill with all of your quirks now than he did with his one quirk at the same level. It will just take practice and hard work, both of which you're unafraid of. Izuku nodded. That was true enough. He remembered the first sports festival Toga had participated in. He had watched it eagerly at home with his dad, taking notes and keeping a running commentary about all of the cool quirks that had been on display. Toga had only really been memorable in that he lost his clothing at the very beginning and lost time having to redress. Izuku didn't really have any memory of Amajiki or Hado at all, either. It just went to show the amount of growth that could be accomplished in such a short amount of time. I did want to speak with you about the man you helped apprehend this afternoon, Sir told him as they entered the elevator. Zia tells me that your telepathic telephone quirk helped authorities track down the criminal's stash of stolen goods. Zia had been his mentor for the day's patrol. She had the ability to turn vibrations into light. The stronger the vibration, the brighter the light. She used it to great effect by carrying a tuning fork and temporarily blinding her opponents to aid in capturing them. That's true, Izuku said. I had almost forgotten about it until it happened. The suspect was cuffed and I was leading him to the policeman by the elbow, and Zia put a hand on my shoulder to get my attention. You expressed concern that gaining information this way might not be strictly legal? Sir asked. That's right, Izuku said with a nod. We kind of read his mind without permission. I wasn't sure if that was like an unlawful search or something like that. The law isn't exactly clear about it. I'll be looking into it, to be sure, Sir assured him. It could be extremely useful in the future, if it's allowed. My own quirk does something similar, where I look into a person's personal future for information. I don't need a warrant for that. I'm sure prosecutors will have something to say about it one way or the other. Until then, try not to use it without a suspect's consent. Izuku agreed, though it was interesting that a quirk he had dismissed as something silly had turned out to be pretty useful after all. Izuku got back to the dorms just in time for dinner that evening, then enjoyed getting caught up on everything that had happened at school. Apparently, Aoyama would be spending the night with Recovery Girl, having had an incident where his naval laser belt became damaged and he'd lost control of his quirk. It was really gross, Mina said with excitement as Izuku expressed concern. You know how he gets sick to his stomach if he uses his laser for more than a few seconds? Well, his belt came off and ripped a hole right through the gym wall until Aizawa could nullify it. It was at least 15 seconds. Aoyama was puking and screaming at the same time. Recovery Girl kept her cool and had it handled in no time, but I really feel bad for Aoyama. I didn't know his laser could be that destructive to his body. I thought it just, gave him gas or something, Sato said. Koda, who hardly ever spoke up, sat stroking his pet rabbit and said, it was really scary. I thought they'd be taking him to the hospital. I'm glad they didn't have to, Izuku said, marveling at how soft the rabbit was when it hopped over and bumped Izuku's hand with its head. A small patch of fur on top of its head grew longer when Izuku's exposed index finger came in contact with it, and he gave an apologetic smile to Koda. Oops. The rabbit didn't seem to care, and hopped over to investigate Uraraka's socks. Sorry about that, Izuku told Koda. It's okay, Koda said with a soft smile. It's cute. Out of all of the animals you can communicate with, what made you choose a rabbit for a pet? Izuku asked. Koda blushed slightly and said with a slight shrug, they're simple. They don't have a lot to communicate beyond their own comfort or hunger. I guess with the ability to understand animals, it's probably pretty overwhelming to hear them all the time, when no one else registers that it means anything. Exactly, Koda said with a nod, looking relieved that his meaning was understood. Rabbits are quiet and affectionate. Oh, he bit my toe, Uraraka said suddenly. Izuku and Koda looked at each other and chuckled. The following day was a Wednesday, which meant that Izuku and Kaken would travel to the agency together for work study. Their first overlapping day since starting at Might Tower was slightly overcast, but the weather reporter swore there was no rain in the immediate future. They each held their cases with their hero costumes inside, and Izuku was quietly muttering to himself about how much it might cost to have a duplicate costume made, so he could keep one at school and the other at the agency. Surely when they went pro, they'd want one wherever they worked and one at wherever they lived, assuming they were different places. Plus, there was damage and wear and tear from battle to consider, so having extra support items for quick replacement was a good idea as well. It's too early for that, sea nerd, Kaken told him gruffly when Izuku continued to talk quietly to himself. Someone's cranky this morning, Toga said cheerfully from where he was standing between his two co-ace. Izuku said, snapping out of his musings and looking at Kaken. He's not cranky. He does look a little tired, though. You really do know him well, don't you? Toga asked Izuku. When I first met him, I thought he was just a super angry guy all the time, but that's just his default setting. He can come off that way, Izuku agreed. But he's really observant and a great strategist. He also likes cats. Sometimes I think that he's so short-fused because when his temper is riled, it makes him sweat more, which is great for using his quirk. I'm standing right here, Kaken pointed out with a growl to his voice. Sorry, Kaken, Izuku said with a wry smile. I can't help it. Your quirk is so cool. What about mine? Toga asked, pretending to pout. He may have been changing the subject because Kaken really was getting annoyed by this point. Yours is a mystery I'm going to solve, Izuku said firmly. I swear I'm going to find a way to get a hit on you before the school year ends. You're welcome to try, Toga said with a friendly rivalry in his tone. But while you're getting even stronger, I'll be growing too. Izuku smiled at the challenge. I'll figure it out. They got to the agency and got changed into their costumes. Izuku had been wondering if he would be patrolling with Kaken. It would be interesting to watch him interacting with people around the city and see how he reacted to everything. Unfortunately, Izuku was assigned to watch the main residence of the Shai Hasaikai group, while Kaken and Lemillion patrolled elsewhere. It was a boring task, because Izuku wasn't allowed to chat with Sir while they observed who came and went, and took note of people who passed by. They were situated in a small room of a building diagonally across the street that housed a handful of small businesses. There was an acupuncturist in an adjacent room on one side and a paralegal on the other, but the smaller one had been used for nothing but storage since the previous tenant had left. It was an adequate, discreet spot for a stakeout, and deemed far enough away for Izuku to not be at risk of gaining any new quirks. Izuku had asked why they didn't just set up security cameras, but apparently there was some sort of signal jamming device or quirk that prevented them from doing so. Sir had a digital camera that he used periodically, capturing DLVOI men, license plates, and even the gardener that came to trim the hedges. A soft, but insistent whir came from Sir's pocket, and when he checked his phone, his eyebrows rose, then drew down into an unhappy glare. We're going. Hurry, he told Izuku as he pocketed his camera and stood. He waited until they were further away, having exited out the back of the building before breaking into a jog, a concerned Izuku keeping pace. There's been a situation. Bakugo and Lemillion had an encounter with Chisaki, and they've apparently taken a child into their custody that Chisaki claimed is his daughter. They took his daughter? Izuku asked in disbelief. No, Chisaki doesn't have any children, Sir said grimly. That we're aware of. We're going to meet them now to get to the bottom of this. Sir then put his phone to his ear and called someone who Izuku assumed was a policeman or detective. The conversation was brief and succinct, but Izuku expected that whomever he'd spoken to would also be meeting them at Might Tower. Trying not to attract too much attention, they caught a cab back to the agency with a gruff driver that looked very much like a llama from the neck up. Once they arrived at Might Tower, Sir led Izuku to the infirmary, rather than his office, and there they saw the girl that Lemillion and Kachen had brought, being looked over by a nurse. The girl looked to be about 4, fragile in a dress that looked like a hospital gown, but without the ties in back. She had long, white hair and a small nub of what looked like a horn to one side of her head, right at the hairline. Her legs were wrapped in bandages, and there was a small pile of unwrapped ones on the table beside her that looked as though they might have been on her skinny arms very recently. Her red eyes were wide and a little frantic-looking as she turned them on Izuku and Sir when they entered. She seemed to curl in on herself, for lack of any place to really hide. Erichan, Lemillion said gently, crouching a little so that he wasn't towering over her. This is who I was telling you about. This is Sir, and that guy over there is Gestalt. They're friends. Hello, Erichan, Izuku said with what he hoped was an encouraging smile. Kaken was scowling deeply, but not at Eri. He just looked frustrated. You're having an exciting day, huh? Izuku asked her, trying to make her feel at ease. I hope it wasn't too scary. We want to help you, okay? He noticed that there were pale scars on her arms, signs of possible puncture wounds from something small and sharp. A needle, maybe? Had she been sick? She did look awfully pale and thin. She tilted her head at him as if he were a puzzle she was trying to figure out, and Izuku just smiled warmly at her. They saved me, she said in a high, tremulous voice. Her eyes flicked over Kaken and then to Lemillion. That's a hero's job, Izuku told her with a solemn nod. We save people who need help. He yelled a lot, and went boom, she said, her eyes flitting back to Kaken. Kaken looked back at her with a small smile that held a bit of pride in it. You were really brave, kid? I was, she asked. She seemed to be talking to Izuku, as if she didn't quite believe Kaken. Izuku nodded firmly and smiled again. If Kaken said you were brave, then you really, really were, she told her. He yells a lot and makes loud noises, but he's one of the bravest heroes I know. Kaken, she asked timidly. That's what I call him, 'cause I've known him since we were your age, Izuku said. In a corner of the room, Lemillion had retreated to have a quiet word with Sir, and Izuku tried not to draw attention to them. How old are you, Eri-chan? He asked her. His chatter was keeping the girl's attention while the nurse unwrapped her legs to reveal even more faint scarring and a few fresh cuts. I think. She looked almost confused by the question. I think I'm 5? It's okay if you don't know for sure, Izuku assured her. It's not really that important. Izuku wasn't sure how much he should ask her, since she was in the middle of a somewhat traumatizing situation, and he didn't want to trigger her in any way. Normally he would ask her about her parents or school, but if she didn't even know how old she was, what were the chances she ever went to school or even knew if she had parents? What's important is that we get you feeling better and keep you safe, he told her instead. I really don't have to go back? She asked timidly. Hell no, Kaken told her, speaking up for the first time. Kaken, don't swear in front of her, Izuku scolded. You don't ever have to go back, Kaken said, rolling his eyes at Izuku. Eri looked relieved to hear this. Sir stepped in then, and crouched in front of Eri. I'm afraid that I'm going to have to take these boys with me for a little while. Do you think you'll be okay here with Nurse Hashimoto? She's very nice, and she'll keep you safe. Eri looked uncertain, but Nurse Hashimoto smiled warmly at her and nodded. Eri finally looked down at her lap and nodded meekly. Izuku felt bad about leaving her with a stranger, but they were all strangers to her. They left her in the care of the nurse and retreated to a conference room where Rapid Fire, Twirl, and a detective were waiting. Izuku wasn't sure if he should be privy to what they would discuss, but his curiosity was too much to point that out to anyone, so he stayed quiet and tried not to draw attention to himself. All right, the detective said as they all took seats. Can we start from the beginning? I'm aware of the Shai Hasaikai as a group, but they've kept under the radar for the most part, so I'm going to need some background for this to make sense. Of course, Sir told him cordially. As you are aware, the Shai Hasaikai is a Yakuza group that got pushed out of the spotlight with virtually all of the others as All Might rose to prominence in Japan. Their leader followed a sort of moral code and he kept his men in line for the most part. An informant from within the group recently came forward to say that the boss was gravely ill and appeared to be in a coma, though there are no medical records of him being admitted to any hospitals anywhere in the country. Why would someone from inside the organization turn informant? The detective asked. Yakuza tend to be pretty tight-knit, and would rather commit seppuku than betray the family. It seems that many of the older members of the group don't like the direction that Chisaki Kai, the new leader, is taking the group in, and many believe he's responsible for the condition the old leader is in, Sir explained. Chisaki is an extreme germaphobe and believes that quirks are a plague on society, hence the plague masks they now wear. He believes that quirks and the so-called disease of heroism was what caused the downfall of the Yakuza, and sees it as his personal mission to raise the Yakuza back to their former glory. Izuku considered this idea, and thought that the concept wasn't all that far off from the ideology of Stain, who wanted to get rid of the majority of heroes for his own twisted reasons. What is it that made you take an interest in him? It hardly seems the type of case the Might Agency would need to trouble themselves with, the detective said, sounding suspicious and curious at the same time. Do you recall the bank robbery a few weeks ago? The perpetrators were arrested, but the money was assumed to have been burned up in the resulting chaos. Sir asked. Izuku wasn't sure what he was talking about, so listened with interest for some insight into the start of the whole investigation. Of course, the detective said. That was a weird one. All of the perps were confused and said that they'd been ambushed, but all they could remember was feeling intense pain. Then they were suddenly being taken into custody, feeling the best they'd ever felt in their lives. Even stuff like cavities and scars and things they'd had before were completely healed. Yes. We believe that Chisaki was involved in that ambush, and that he used his quirk on them. We have no proof, but we're working on the assumption that the Shai Hasaikai is now several million yen richer since that day, Sir said. We've been suspicious of their movements since then, and have been looking for concrete proof of criminal activity to make a case with. How does that tie into your staff taking possession of a child? The detective asked, taking notes every once in a while. Sir, if I may? Lemillion said. At Sir and the detective's nod, Lemillion picked up the explanation. I was taking Bakugo out on a routine patrol of the area, and as we passed by a random alley, the girl ran out and collided with Bakugo. I helped her to her feet, and she threw herself at me, shaking like a leaf, clearly terrified. She was barefoot and her arms and legs were wrapped in bandages, he said. She asked for help, but before we could do more than ask if she was lost, Chisaki Kai showed up and claimed she was his daughter, and that she'd run away because he scolded her. Kaken made a disdainful noise at that point, but didn't interrupt further. Izuku kept quiet and listened to the unfolding story. Bakugo asked about her bandages, and Chisaki claimed that she's a clumsy child, always falling down and getting hurt. It didn't sound right, but I was trying to avoid making him suspicious of us, since I knew we were already keeping an eye on him. Chisaki called to her and told her to come back, but she clung on to me and asked us not to leave. Bakugo asked her if he was really her dad, and she shook her head and sighed no. Izuku's jaw clenched as he listened, knowing that he wouldn't have been able to leave her there in a situation like that. Chisaki acted embarrassed by the attention we were drawing, and asked us if we would follow him off of the main street, so he could explain the situation, since it was a private matter. It was clear that he was planning something. You could just feel the bloodlust pouring off of him, but he was already walking back into the alley. I kept a hold of Eri, and we followed him a few steps, then the wall stretched behind us to close off the street we just stepped off of, Togata said. He was trying to trap us in with him, but Bakugo turned and blew out an opening, so we could get out of there. Chisaki tried to make a grab for me, but I used my quirk and we fled back to the main street. That's when Twirl and Rapid Fire showed up. They heard Bakugo's explosions and came to investigate. The other two sidekicks nodded in confirmation. Chisaki had his gloves off, Rapid Fire said. He's never been seen in public without them because of his germophobia. I'm assuming he was prepared to use his quirk. His quirk is called Overhaul, Sir supplied for the detective, who was taking more complete notes by this time. He has the ability to disassemble and then reassemble matter with his bare hands. That would include people, I'm assuming, the detective asked wearily. Like bank robbers? We believe so, Sir confirmed. Chisaki promised to cure us of our disease and take back what's his, Twirl said. Then he was literally just swallowed up by the wall and vanished. We took the kid and ran. It's probably safe to assume there was another of Chisaki's subordinates nearby using a quirk to manipulate the walls, the detective said grimly. I can call social services to come and take custody of the child. With all respect, I was wondering if we could make arrangements to keep the child here, for the time being, Sir said seriously. Izuku's jaw dropped when he heard this. We don't yet know who she is, or why Chisaki had her in his custody, Sir pointed out. I can't think of a safer place for her right now, until we can learn more about her. At least one member of the League of Villains has been in contact with the Shai Hasaikai, so I can't imagine a scenario that doesn't put that child in danger elsewhere. That isn't really up to me, the detective said with a shake of his head, but I can put you in touch with the people who have the power to decide that. For now, I'll report that she's currently receiving medical care here, and that moving her could be detrimental to her well-being. I'll want to see any information you've gathered about Chisaki Kai and his whole organization so we can make sure we're adequately covering our bases. Sir agreed easily. Does anyone else have anything to add? The detective asked. He looked directly at Izuku, who was the only one who hadn't spoken during the meeting. Izuku shook his head ruefully, admitting that he hadn't been there. Gestalt seemed to have an immediate rapport with the girl, Sir said simply. I'm hoping to utilize him to keep her calm while she's examined and questioned. The detective simply nodded and made another small note before asking to speak to each of the others one at a time to clarify different points. Standard procedure. Izuku stood, feeling embarrassed at being caught attending a meeting he hadn't strictly been invited to, and following the others out of the room. The detective would talk to Kaken first, and the other three took seats in a small lounge area near the elevators to wait for their turns. Sir motioned for Izuku to follow him. The fact that Chisaki had a child that he obviously didn't want to lose custody of is a worrying prospect, he told Izuku as they ascended to the floor that housed Sir's office. And that's aside from the possibility that Chisaki is working with the League of Villains in some way. I'm afraid she's been through a terrible amount of trauma, and I need to get a hold of my informant within the organization if possible, to find out more. Izuku was wondering why he was being allowed to be included in this investigation, since Sir had indicated that he should stay as far away from Chisaki Kai and the Shai Hasaikai case as possible. The answer to that was a little surprising. Mirio told me that Eri didn't really speak much at all until you showed up and talked to her. For whatever reason, she seems to instinctively trust you, and that's lucky for us. I want you to spend as much time with her as possible without upsetting her, and see if you can get any helpful information out of her. Make a list of things you think a little girl might enjoy and might make her feel more comfortable here, and I'll see to it that someone outside of our organization obtains them. I don't know a lot about little girls, Izuku said nervously. But, don't they like bright colors and unicorns and sparkly stuff? I have absolutely no idea, Sir said seriously. I believe some of your friends are girls? Perhaps you could ask some of them. Just don't tell them why you need to know. Right? Good idea, Izuku said. So, should I just go back to the infirmary for now? Sir nodded. Depending on whether we'll be allowed to keep her here in our custody for a while, we'll need to set up a more comfortable atmosphere for her to live in. I don't know what conditions she's been living under until now, but I doubt it's been pleasant. Izuku made his way down to the infirmary to see Eri, but found that she was curled up into a tight ball, fast asleep, with her small hands fisted into the blanket. She looked even smaller than he remembered from just an hour ago. Poor thing is just scared to death, the nurse said quietly to Izuku when he retreated from the dimly lit room so he wouldn't wake Eri. Did she say anything more about before she was brought here? Izuku asked. The nurse shook her head sadly. She asked where you and the others had gone, but after that, she just sat there obediently and let me clean her up. As soon as I helped her into a different gown and into bed, she curled up and closed her eyes. It took her a few minutes, but she finally fell asleep. I'm supposed to make a list of things she might need or like to have, Izuku said. But I'm kind of at a loss for anything to do with little girls. Could you help? The nurse smiled at this and nodded, leading Izuku back to her desk, where they put together a list of clothing, toiletries and toys that might help Eri adjust to her newfound freedom. Kaken showed up just as Izuku was texting Sir a photo of the list, and asked how the kit was doing. Once he was assured that she was safe, he and Izuku changed back into their school uniforms. They had been told that they had done enough work for the day, and could return to school for now. Kaken would be back the next day for his regularly scheduled shift, but they also asked Izuku to return after his daily classes, to spend some time with Eri. He was fine with that. Izuku's sleep was plagued with nightmares that night for the first time in a while. He had vague memories when he woke, of bodies floating in murky fluid, needles full of blood, and people around him dying. His eyes felt grainy and his lids heavy as he went about his morning routine of getting ready for school. Thankfully, it wasn't his day to help with breakfast. He slid into a chair just as Kaken was leaving for his work study, and Izuku waved to him tiredly. Kaken nodded in response, which was practically friendly behavior between them. As he was leaving, Kaminari came thundering in from the elevator waving his phone. Kirishima. Kirishima was in the kitchen with an apron on, scooping rice into a bowl for Todoroki, who still looked mostly asleep. You're in the news? Kaminari shouted, getting everyone's attention. Newcomer sidekick Red Riot bursts onto the scene. Uravity and Froppy got mentioned for their work, too. Mina said, holding up her own phone. Many of them gathered around to look at the articles, but Kirishima didn't look as excited as Izuku would have thought he'd be by the news. Is everything okay? Izuku asked him quietly. Kirishima sighed. I don't know if I'm allowed to talk about it, but Amajiki's senpai got a bit hurt last night. I just wish I could have been faster. Izuku nodded in sympathy and patted Kirishima's shoulder. It happens? Ida made an appearance at that point, looking well-rested and energetic as he urged everyone to eat a healthy breakfast before the start of classes. Izuku felt bad for pushing off so many of the class rep duties onto his friend, but when he'd pointed it out, Ida simply said it was his job as second in command, as it were. As more kids crowded into the dining area, Izuku began to feel closer to normal than he had since the previous day. The nightmares of the evening before faded away to nothing, and the rest of the school day was spent focusing on his studies. During basic hero training, Izuku worked with Uraraka, who had a day off from her own work study, and tried to teach her how to use her anti-gravity on herself to travel longer distances. She could already do a sort of moonwalk, not the dancing kind, to bound around, but it was slow and not as graceful as it could be. If he held her hand while they jumped, Uraraka could travel almost as well as Izuku could, being pulled along by his momentum. Izuku wondered if a support item to give her a little move as she jumped might be what she needed to really cover distance. It probably also wouldn't hurt for me to start some serious leg workouts to make my jump stronger, she lamented. He offered to help her with that too, before waving goodbye as she went to have a chat with Hatsum in the development studio. He hoped there was something they could do to help Uraraka with her jumps, since he knew firsthand how useful it could be in a fight. The idea of pairing up with her for a super move or two held a lot of appeal, and he was already thinking of different ways they could plan strategies around it when class ended. All Might was waiting for Izuku at the bottom of the stairs as the students were filing out to go back to their dorms. I'll be going back to Might Tower early today, he said. I'll give you a lift. Izuku changed course amiably, wondering if this was a ploy to keep him from leaving the school grounds on his own to report for work. Either way, it was nice to spend some one-on-one time with All Might. It seemed like it had been ages since that had happened. I'm impressed with what I've been hearing about you this week, All Might told him as they made their way through the city. I don't feel like I've done all that much, Izuku admitted. But I'm learning a lot. It might not seem like much, but the presence of mind to do small things like take photos of suspects and keep in communication with your team is a valuable asset. Mirai said you're good with children too. I don't know about that, Izuku said with a small smirk, thinking of the way Koda had tried to punch him in the crotch at their training camp. But Eri is easy to relate to, I guess? Mirai has learned a lot about that case since yesterday, All Might said. There will be a special meeting tomorrow with some other hero agencies to discuss it. You'll be allowed to be there so that you know what's going on, but we want you to keep in mind that you're not to be anywhere near Chisaki Kai and his group if it's decided that we need to take action. So that was the motive behind the ride to the agency, another reminder of how his quirk made him unfit for this type of mission. He deflated a little. I'm sorry, my boy, All Might said, correctly reading Izuku's body language. As useful as some of these villains' quirks may be. I know, Izuku said with a sigh. We don't know if I have any limits for how many quirks I can absorb, and I need to have better control over which ones I know we sound like we're stuck on repeat, but it's important, All Might commiserated. Until we find a way to control or negate inheritance, it's the only way to be sure. Too bad Monoma couldn't choose which quirk to copy, Izuku lamented. He might have been able to tell me if there's an off SWH for it. It's hard to believe, my boy, but you've only been at UA a few months. Give it time. You've seen the pictures of my middle school days, haven't you? Do they compare to where I was when I left UA 3 years later? Izuku snorted. Definitely not. That was comforting, since Izuku was on the small side for the boys in his class. He didn't come close to being the imposing figure he felt the public would look for in a crisis. What were the chances he'd get a bit taller before he was done growing? He knew the odds were against him, but he could always hope. Eri seemed excited to see him, but still didn't smile when he arrived. She didn't seem to know how to smile, which made Izuku's heart ache. He was pleased to see that instead of the boring hospital blankets she'd had before, she now had a fluffy, incredibly soft, purple comforter with stars and moons all over it in white and yellow. She had it wrapped around her even though it wasn't cold in the room, a good sign that she liked it. There was a stack of children's books at the foot of the bed, and a small television playing a cartoon about learning to get along with others. One book was open in her lap, about a rabbit apparently. "Hello, Eri." Izuku greeted her with a smile. "Jeslat." Izuku chuckled. "Close. It's Gestalt. That's just my hero name, though. My real name is Midoriya Izuku." "You have two names?" she asked. "I only have one." Izuku came in and sat down in the chair by her bed. "I'm learning to be a hero, and heroes get to have two names if they want. Their hero name usually has something to do with their quirk, but not always." "What should I call you?" Eri asked him, sounding a bit confused. "Well, when I'm in my hero costume, you should probably call me Gestalt, but since I'm dressed in my school uniform today, you can just call me Midoriya." Midoriya. The bad men. Some of them had two names, but they didn't help people. "They're bad," she said. "Sometimes villains like to pretend they're important enough to get two names, too," Izuku tried to explain. "Like the man who tried to pretend he's your father." Eri twisted the ends of the blanket around her hands and her eyes darted around the room, as if she was afraid that talking about Chisaki would make him appear. "They called him Overhaul," she whispered. It was said so softly that he almost didn't hear her. He nodded solemnly and let her adjust to the idea that she could talk to him about it without anything bad happening. "I know," he finally said, when she seemed lost in a memory. "He's definitely a villain. A villain is a bad guy who hurts good people. Like what he did to me," Eri whispered, her eyes glossy. "We won't let him do that anymore," Izuku promised. "This building is full of heroes, and every single one of us wants to protect you and keep you safe." "It's nice here," Eri said cautiously. "I'm glad you think so," Izuku said. "Sir Knight, I was going to ask if you could stay here for a while. This is where All Might lives, you know." "All Might?" she asked. "The bad men don't like him." "I heard them say it." "I'm sure they don't," Izuku said with a smile. "He's the best hero there ever was." "He's a hero?" Eri asked. "You don't know who All Might is?" Izuku asked with a little surprise. "He's my favorite hero ever." Izuku launched into a child-level explanation of who All Might was and why he was so great. He showed her pictures on his phone, and before they knew it, it was rapidly getting dark outside. "You two seem to be getting along well," came a voice from the doorway. "Lemillion." Again, Eri seemed excited, but her face didn't seem able to show happiness. Still, she sat up straighter and put all of her attention on him. "Hello, Eri-chan. I came to check on you and let you know that your room is ready. Sir will be down in a couple of minutes to take you upstairs." Lemillion's hair was a bit mussed, and there was mud on his boots. He must have just come back from a somewhat eventful patrol. "My room?" she asked, twisting the blankets again. "That's right. If you're going to be living here for a little while, you'll want to have your own space, right?" Lemillion said cheerfully. "It's okay, Eri," Izuku told her. "My tower is a really fun place. I think you'll like it here." While the nurse put Eri's new things into bags to be taken upstairs, Izuku and Lemillion tried to put her at ease about this change in her life. "I've never been anywhere outside of the compound since my mommy left," she confessed. "The compound?" Lemillion guessed. She nodded gravely. "As soon as we get all the bad guys locked up, we'll make sure you get outside as much as you like," Lemillion told her. Sir arrived a couple of minutes later, his face a mask of gentleness as he regarded Eri. "Hello, Eri. Did Lemillion tell you that your room is ready?" Eri nodded shyly, clinging to her blanket. "Would you like to walk, or would you prefer to be carried, or ride in a wheelchair?" Sir asked her. "The choice is yours." Izuku knew she was perfectly capable of walking, physically. What felt safest to her was another matter. "It's okay, Eri," Izuku told her when she didn't answer or move for a few moments. "I'll walk with you, and I won't leave until you say it's okay. What do you say?" He held out his hand in an offer of support. "Lemillion too?" she asked. "Lemillion too," the man in question answered. Sir had gathered her books and another bag from the nurse that looked like it held clothing. Eri looked at each of them in turn, then scooted to the edge of the bed. Izuku gently lifted her and set her on the ground, where the nurse crouched to place a pair of pink fuzzy slippers on her feet in preparation for the short walk. Eri clutched Izuku's hand and stood close to him while Lemillion gathered her blanket, and they all made their way to the elevator. Eri was curious about everything she saw, it was evident in her eyes, but she didn't ask any questions. She had a slight moment of panic when the elevator doors slid closed behind them, but Sir was quick to explain that it was like taking the stairs, and that they were traveling up to another part of the building. She relaxed when the doors slid open to reveal a spacious area that Izuku recognized as the floor that led to a separate elevator to reach the top floors, where Sir and All Might's offices and living quarters were located. Izuku saw that Eri was watching very closely as Sir used the retinal scanner to gain access to doors and elevators. "That's a special machine that won't open unless the right person tells it to," he explained to her. "You'll be in the safest place in Japan." He wasn't sure if she had a concept of what Japan even was, but the explanation seemed to satisfy her. She followed without demurring into the next elevator that took them to the very top floor. "Here we are," Sir said, spreading his hands to indicate the whole area. "This is where you'll be living for the next little while." Eri looked around shyly, but squeezed Izuku's hand even harder than before. He made a decision and scooped her into his arms, careful to watch for any signs that he was scaring her. When he saw none, he pasted a smile on his face that wasn't even a little forced as he took her over to one of the wide windows looking over the city. "Oh," Eri breathed, looking out into darkness at all of the neon and colorful signs and other lights far below them. "It's pretty." Lemillion grinned at that. "We're up very high," Eri said, careful to grip Izuku's jacket, but not clinging to him in fear. "We are," Sir agreed. "I hope you'll like it here. The boys can give you a tour while I arrange to have some dinner brought up for you. Is there anything you'd like to eat?" "I like apples," she answered at once, for once not shying away from Sir. He smiled kindly at her and nodded. "I'll make sure that they send one." From there, Izuku set Eri down and walked her around the space, showing her where the toilet was, the seating area, a small kitchen, a huge television set, the closed door to All Might's quarters and the open door to Sir's quarters. Each man had his own apartment on this floor, but Izuku had never had more than a glimpse inside of Sir's before. He'd never had a reason. Against the wall in the main area between apartments, under the television, there was a colorful bookshelf with a selection of books, a couple of stuffed animals, some building blocks and a few other toys that hadn't been taken out of their packaging yet. There was also a child-sized table with chairs that was obviously new, with a caddy full of crayons, pencils and markers. Sir had been busy, or at least he'd made someone else busy. There was even a smaller recliner-like chair among the other tall adult-sized chairs that was just a bit too small to be meant for Grand's use. "Dinner will be up shortly," Sir announced, coming back into the room. Eri was looking at everything somewhat dispassionately, but she might have never been given such things before, or know what to do with them. Before anyone could comment further, the door to All Might's rooms opened, and the man himself stepped out. He had a box in his arms, and blinked when he saw the group assembled. "Perfect timing," he said with a smile. "You must be Eri." Eri nodded, but shrunk back behind Izuku's legs, peeking out from behind them. "I told you about All Might, remember?" Izuku told her gently. "I showed you pictures." She nodded slowly, but didn't come out. "I know I'm a bit scary looking," All Might told her easily, sitting down on the floor with his box. "But I promise I'm one of the good guys. I have something here for you that young Bakugo went to the trouble of finding this afternoon." "Bako?" Eri asked. "He's the one that went boom and made the wall crash down." "That's right," Lemillion said. "He's a hero too." "Kaken got Eri a gift?" Izuku asked in surprise. "He did. He thought it might help her feel less lonely," All Might confirmed. "Would you like to have a look?" Eri nodded hesitantly, and shuffled forward, which made Izuku shuffle forward as well. It wasn't until they were right in front of the box that she stepped out to peek inside. Inside was the puffiest, angriest-looking kitten that Izuku had ever seen. It looked like a feline version of Kaken, but with orange eyes and fur. Its nose was smashed in and its whiskers corkscrewed in all directions, giving it a wild appearance. Its ears were lying flat against its head, and was it growling? Purring. Eri gasped at the sight, but Izuku held her back with his arm. Are you sure it's safe? It looks kind of mean, he cautioned. Kaken had picked it out, after all. He probably liked cats with a little spirit to them. Perfectly safe, All Might assured them. She looks a bit rough, but it's just the way she's made. She's actually quite playful and affectionate. Izuku noticed that All Might's eyes were a bit red, and wondered if he was allergic. He said her name is Nabham, but I'm sure you can name her whatever you like, All Might told Eri. Me? She asked uncertainly. She's going to be your pet if you want her, All Might told her. It's only right that you get to name her, if you want. Eri looked a little overwhelmed, but seemed drawn to the tiny fur ball. She carefully crouched down and regarded it solemnly. Would you like to hold her? Izuku asked her, when she seemed hesitant. I shouldn't touch her, Eri said, shaking her head. He said I was cursed. Sir's brow furrowed and he kneeled down beside her slowly. Why would anyone say that? Because it's true, she said softly, still looking at the kitten. I made my daddy disappear, and that's why my mommy left. I ruin everything I touch. That's just not true, Izuku told her. You've touched me and Lemillion and Kaken, and we're all fine. She seemed to think about this as she continued to regard the kitten. He said I was a centipede of his plans, Eri said. Centipede? All Might asked. Centerpiece, Sir corrected. Eri nodded gravely. He said my body can make bullets to stop quirks, Eri said. Bullets? Lemillion asked, looking agitated. Eri nodded again. I'm sorry. Her eyes began to get glassy as if she might cry, and Izuku quickly scooped up the surly-looking cat in his gloved hand and put it in Eri's lap. She gasped at first, but Izuku kept his hand there to keep it secure. It meowed a bit, but continued to purr. See? Nothing bad happened, he told her. She moved from a crouch to sit on the floor with her legs out in front of her, and the cat stayed where it was, seemingly content. Izuku gently took Eri by the wrist and guided her hand over the fur on its head and back, so she was petting it. It's soft, she exclaimed. Still no smile, but at least intense interest and maybe fascination. The cat purred and rubbed its face on her hand for a while before it jumped from her lap and began to explore. All Might assured Sir that there was a proper litter box installed and plentiful amounts of food and toys. Eri followed the kitten around, simply watching it, and they let her explore with it while they stood together to discuss what she'd told them about Overhaul. Tamaki was hit with a quirk-canceling bullet on his last patrol down in the Kansai region, Lemillion said urgently. It wore off after a few hours, but the guy that shot him also used quirk enhancers on himself just after that. He was experimenting on her, Izuku said with gritted teeth and balled fists. Green crackles began to spark around him, and Sir put a grounding hand on his arm to calm him. We don't want to frighten the girl, he said simply. Knowing what he said about her body, it's imperative that we discover what her quirk is, quickly. If she truly is the centerpiece of his plan, then he may become reckless in his attempts to get her back. Dinner was delivered on a cart by a sidekick a moment later, and Eri looked on with interest as food was spread out on the large table by the window at the back of the huge room. One of the seats was stacked with pillows to make it tall enough for Eri. There seemed to be a bit of everything, and Izuku guessed that Sir had asked for a variety, since he didn't know what Eri liked to eat, besides apples. In fact, she was thrilled by the apple slices that had been cut to look like bunnies with cute little picks in to hold them by. They all sat together to eat, and Eri seemed to not know what to think of it. It seemed that she didn't ever join any group at mealtimes, and was instead just given a tray 3 times a day for her to eat or not. It turned out that she liked curry, so was content to sit with this strange group of men. Izuku and Lemillion kept up a steady stream of chatter about Might Tower and how nice it was that Eri would get to be there with them for a while. She kept a careful watch on the kitten if she could see it from her seat, but otherwise sat like an overly obedient child, even when she was obviously finished eating. Are you ready to see your room, Eri? Sir finally asked her, when she continued to sit stiffly in her chair. She nodded, then looked at Izuku and Lemillion. We're coming. Lemillion promised. I want to see what it looks like too, Izuku told her, injecting excitement into his tone. He had been trying hard not to focus on the idea that Overhaul and his goons had been using Eri for experiments or to make quirk-canceling bullets. His jaw was sore from clenching his teeth so much. They got up from the table and went to Sir's quarters, which had a modern Japanese decor that was both elegant and comfortable. Off to the side, there was a small room that had probably been a very large closet/dressing room before yesterday, since there were racks of clothing hanging in front of the windows in Sir's bedroom. The small space was perfect for a child-sized bed and wardrobe, painted in soft pastels. There was an all-might night light plugged into the wall, which would no doubt give off a bluish glow when the lights were turned off. Izuku had a similar one in his dorm room. There was an assortment of stuffed animals and other toys within easy reach, and a large red button above the headboard, under a clear plastic bubble. It was labeled Panic SWH. Izuku had to admire the work that had gone into keeping Eri truly safe in body and mind. Lemillion patted the mattress on the bed and pulled back the covers for Eri. "You're tired, aren't you?" he asked. Eri nodded, and the suggestion of being tired made her yawn. Izuku felt himself needing to fight back a yawn as well. Since Eri was already wearing pajamas from earlier, no one insisted she change. They just smiled encouragingly as she climbed up and settled back on the pillows. All Might joined them at that point, carrying the purple blanket from earlier and the kitten in his hands. Eri cuddled the blanket like one might hug a teddy bear, and watched as the kitten toddled up to make itself comfortable on the pillow beside her head. "I'll leave you to get some sleep," Sir told her softly. "I'll just be in the next room. You may wake me at any time, for any reason." Eri didn't seem to know how to react to this, so she simply nodded. All Might simply bid her a quiet good night, and retreated, leaving Lemillion and Izuku to finish tucking her in. "Do you feel safe here, Eri?" Lemillion asked her, reaching over to slide the purring kitten. She thought about it for a moment before she nodded. "You're leaving, aren't you?" "Just for tonight," Izuku told her quickly. "We live at our school but we'll be coming back here tomorrow, at least for a little while. Will you be okay?" Eri bit her lip, as if she wasn't sure if she was allowed to say what was on her mind. "What's the matter?" Lemillion asked her. "Can you stay until I fall asleep?" she asked, sounding nervous. "Of course," Lemillion said with a smile. "You haven't even had your bedtime story yet?" "What's that?" she asked with serious eyes. "It's part of the bedtime ritual. There should always be a story before bed," Lemillion told her. Izuku wondered if Sir was aware that Lemillion was setting him up to read to Eri nightly from now on. The idea was cute. Lemillion sat on the floor and reached over to the bedside table where there was a glass of water and a couple of books within easy reach of small hands. He chose one of the books without even checking what it was and opened it to the first page. Izuku kneeled on the floor, resting his arm on the bed so he could watch Eri enjoy the story. Lemillion did a good job, using different voices for each of the characters as he told the story of a kappa that kept getting tricked into bowing, causing the water to pour out of the dip in his head that gave him his strength. By the time Lemillion finished with a happy ending of the forest creatures sharing their meal with the hungry kappa, Eri's face was slack, and her mouth hung open slightly as she slept. The two boys tiptoed from the room and left the door cracked open for the little girl inside. True to his word, Sir was sitting up on his bed, reading a book so he wouldn't be too far from Eri. He thanked the boys and bid them good night, and they went back to the dorms with a feeling of accomplishment and determination to make sure Eri had a good life from now on. The following morning, Izuku and Kaken were surprised when Kirishima, Uraraka and Tsuyu all caught up with them as they left for the meeting at Might Tower. They said that their mentors had been asked to help collaborate and share information about a case at Might Tower, and that they were being allowed to attend as well. They all rode the train together, chatting about what it could all mean, and though Izuku had a better idea than they did, he said nothing. Sir and All Might would tell them what they wanted the others to know. When they got to the conference room on one of the lower floors of Might Tower, they found Togata, Heido and Amajiki all there already. On top of that, Aizawa-sensei was present, and so was Gran Torino and many other heroes from all over Japan. Some even Izuku had never heard of, but was eager to hear about. All of All Might and Sir's sidekicks were present, except for Twirl, but Gran told him in a low voice that she had been commandeered to watch Eri, since Twirl had two younger sisters. The room was set up with several tables pushed end to end in a large rectangle to accommodate them all, and even then, some of them were left to stand or sit in chairs against the walls. Izuku didn't feel like he deserved a place at the tables, since he wouldn't be allowed to participate much in the case, so he stood behind his classmates, closer to the wall, to listen. All Might was wearing a suit, which wasn't too odd considering he was a teacher at UA, but it was well tailored to his tall form and made him look livelier, somehow. It was nice to see him in clothes he didn't swim in, even if it meant that the reason was because he no longer had access to his heroic form. Sir wore the same suit as always, and the two men stood at the head of the room, in front of a screen that could project their presentation, if needed. "Thank you all for coming," Sir told them all in a serious voice that carried through the room. "We put out a call through the Hero Network, asking for volunteers and for particular skill sets and from certain regions, because a case we've been investigating has suddenly blown up, and we need both information and assistance." "That's great and all," one of the heroes at the table spoke up, "but why are there a bunch of school kids here? UA students or not, won't they just slow us down?" Izuku recognized the man as the hero Rocklock, whose quirk lockdown allowed him to touch objects and lock them into a fixed place, even the middle of the air. Fat Gum took that opportunity to stand and point out that his two work-study interns were essential to the investigation, and Izuku couldn't help but notice that Kirishima looked baffled by this news. "Sun Eater here took a bullet the other night, during Red Riot's Fantastic Hero debut." Fat Gum informed them all. "By the way, I'm seeing lots of unfamiliar faces, so I'll introduce myself. I'm Fat Gum. Pleased to meet ya." "A bullet?" Tsuyu asked, alarmed. "Are you okay, senpai?" "It wasn't just any bullet," Fat Gum announced loudly. "It was a bullet filled with a drag that destroys quirks." That got a big reaction as many made exclamations of disbelief or dread. Izuku's fists were balled at his sides. "I was able to use my quirk again after a good night's sleep," Amajiki told them, holding up a cow's hoof where his right hand would normally be. "So it's temporary?" Rocklock asked. "Not fatal at least." "Tamaki was taken to the hospital," Fat Gum said. "They did a battery of tests and found that his quirk factor had been damaged. His normal healing ability will be enough to erase the damage completely over time, but I'm afraid this is only the beginning. The bullet that hit him and the gun used were destroyed, but Red Riot hardened in time and the other bullet bounced off of him, so we were able to have it analyzed." "Me? Really? I had no idea." Izuku marveled at the fact that Kirishima could fail to notice he'd been shot. Others congratulated him on it, but he just looked stunned. Fat Gum looked as grim as it was possible for him to look. "I've taken down more black market drag rings than I care to count," he said, shaking his head in disgust. "Mostly quirk enhancers from overseas. The ones from Asia only last a short time, but there are stronger ones from places like America that can last hours, or even days. But I've never seen anything like this before. This bullet was made with human cells and blood." Many eyes went to Aizawa, the only one they knew who was capable of turning off another person's quirk temporarily. "My quirk only disrupts a quirk holder's ability to access their quirk. It doesn't affect the quirk itself. I can't affect any mutation quirk, like making a tail or fur disappear, but if they can manipulate the tail or fur in some way, I can block their ability to do that," Aizawa explained. "So they're using someone with a quirk-canceling quirk to produce these bullets?" Ryukyu asked. "That's barbaric that even if the person involved was complicit." "They weren't," Kaken spat out, seeming unable to keep quiet. Everyone in the room looked shocked. Izuku felt sick. Kaken looked livid. Sir nodded. "Bakugu is correct. Chisaki Kai, also known as Overhaul, was holding a young girl captive, claiming she's his daughter. We have every reason to believe that they were experimenting on her and using her body to produce these bullets." Izuku could hear a grating sound, and it took him a moment to realize it was his own teeth, grinding in anger and frustration. "You're speaking in past tense," one of the other heroes pointed out. "Two of my men managed to rescue her after she made an attempt to escape captivity," Sir said, nodding to Togata and Kaken. "We currently have her in our custody, until we can shut down the Shai Hasaikai." "Is that why you called us all? To help you go after them?" Rocklock asked. In due time, All Might told them, speaking up for the first time. "We have to plan this especially carefully, making sure we have all of our ducks in a row. There is a very complicated supply chain for the importation and exportation of these drags. Both the enhancers and the quirk-canceling ones. We want to cast our net wide with simultaneous strikes at each known location or each dealer and supplier. There is a very real possibility that the temporary quirk destroyer is just the first step in a much larger plan. It's common practice in drag dealing to offer a taste of what they could have before offering the real thing. These could be a teaser to amass money and gather a following before the release of something more permanent. Imagine a bullet that could permanently take away someone's quirk. Now, imagine that there is only one supplier and one person might or might not have a cure. So you think there's a cure as well? One of the heroes asked with interest. There's no concrete evidence either way, but I would rather it not become an issue. We know that the Shai Hasaikai has people high up in the supply chain for the quirk-enhancing drags, and well-placed to distribute or export their own products. A screen lit up behind All Might and Sir, showing a chart that had tons of branches cascading down with names and a map that corresponded with different known locations. The ones directly associated with the Shai Hasaikai were highlighted for them all to see. As you can see, this is a huge undertaking that will involve as many heroes and police agencies as are available to help. We approached Endeavor and Hawk's agencies, and are still waiting to find out their availability. Best Jeanist is making progress in his recovery but is still unable to return to duty. Ed Shot is already working on a different angle of the same case, and the rest of the top 10 will lend a hand when we have more detailed plans. While this is going on, we can't leave the rest of Japan unprotected from other threats, All Might told them all. We need support at every level, and any intel that can be gathered about any of the people on our suspect list. Many of you here today have already had dealings with some of these, which is why we requested you, in particular. Izuku wondered if he would be allowed to assist in any of the operations where there was no chance of his being near Overhaul, or if he would be benched because of the high probability of injury or death. How could he truly be All Might's successor if he couldn't even participate in raids? The discussions continued as each hero asked questions and shared intel, and Izuku wished he had brought one of his notebooks to keep track of everything, even though he knew that everything was likely being recorded for later transcription. He startled when there was a light knock on the door of the conference room. We asked for bentos to be delivered at lunchtime, Bubble Girl said as heads swiveled at the sound. Izuku moved toward the door to let them in and lend a hand, surprised that it was already that late in the day. He opened the door, and wasn't prepared to have a gun pointed at him, and to feel the punch of a projectile piercing his skin. Ambush, he shouted, even as blood began to spread through his school shirt and onto his hand as he gripped his wound. Get down. He felt one for all spring to life within him as more people forced their way into the room, all of them armed with handguns. The door splintered and was torn from its hinges as the assailants forced their way past it. Izuku acted on instinct and muscle memory as he disarmed the man who had shot him and kicked out at another who was firing wildly into the crowd of heroes. How's he still using his quirk? One of them asked another. He got hit point blank. Demed faulty piece of sheet, one of them swore, before Izuku was in his face and taking him down. The room was in pandemonium, and suddenly an alarm was blaring, and a loud rumble shook the whole building. My tower is now on complete lockdown. Do not attempt to leave the building. Do not use elevators. Find shelter immediately and remain as silent as possible. Authorities have been alerted. The recorded voice seemed to come from all directions, and though they all sounded like Japanese to Izuku, he could tell that the warnings were being delivered in other languages as well. Izuku tried to ignore the klaxon wailing and worked to subdue as many assailants as he could. Several of the heroes in the room were shouting that their quirks had been turned off, but all of them were fighting. Quirks were only a part of what qualified anyone to be a hero. Izuku, Mirio, go to Eri. Protect her at all costs. Sir shouted across the room. I can't phase, Mirio gritted out. I got hit with one of those bullets. I'll go. Izuku shouted back. He dashed out to the darkened hallway, relieved to find that there were no other thugs waiting there. The wall where the windows should be were now shuttered. The sound of rumbling earlier must have been the lockdown protocols closing the building up to keep anyone from entering or leaving. How sturdy were they? Izuku was still thinking about it when Sir appeared beside him. The stairwells will all be blocked off, though I can work to override that. The windows are all covered with bulletproof galvanized steel, on top of the heat-strengthened glass of the normal windows. Can I get through? I can push my power up to 35, maybe 36%, Izuku asked, feeling a sense of urgency. If the villains had waited for other comrades to position themselves throughout the building before entering the conference room, they could already be far too close to Eri. If not, there's a weak spot in the floor and ceiling of each floor that should allow you to smash through, but that would also make a path for anyone who wanted to follow me, Izuku finished angrily. Who's guarding Eri? Twirl. Her force field should keep attackers at bay for a while, Sir said. He had hoped Eri would have more than one bodyguard, but they had never expected anything like this. Stand back, Izuku told Sir. Others had been coming out into the hall, and Sir spread his arms and signaled for them to step back. Izuku charged one for all until he felt like his bones would catch fire before he drew back his leg and kicked the window with as much strength as he could manage. The glass cracked, radiating out from the point of impact, and Izuku kicked again, causing large chunks to fall to the carpeted floor. His shoes weren't equipped with the shell to give his kicks extra impact, and were definitely not designed to protect his feet from such abuse, but Izuku ignored the pain. The only thing he cared about was getting to Eri and keeping her safe. Once you reach the roof, the code to override the door into the living quarters is your BRDH date, Sir told him as the metal creaked and bulged outward after a heavy punch. Let me through in a minute. Kaken forced his way past the crowd at the door and shoved Izuku aside. Save your arms for fightin', he ordered Izuku. In the next moment, there was a huge explosion from both of Kaken's hands, and a ragged hole in the steel rolling shutters. Go! The command came from Sir and Kaken at the same time. Izuku didn't hesitate to throw himself out and engage his levitation with as much one for all as he could force into it. He shot up like cork from a bottle, and didn't let up until he was nearly to the top of the building. Only then did he engage his mother's quirk. Because the building obviously couldn't move to Izuku, Izuku was pulled to it, and he made it onto the roof in moments. He ran to the retinal and palm scanner, and an automated voice accompanied a red flashing light on the palm pad. Lockdown in progress. Access denied. Enter code to override. A digital number pad appeared on the palm plate, and Izuku entered his birth date on it. Access granted. The door will relock in 5, 4, 3. The steel security blinds retracted once access was granted, and Izuku quickly jerked the door open and rushed inside, stumbling down the steps in his haste. As soon as the door closed behind him, there was a solid sounding clack as the door relocked and the shutters slid back into place. The space was dimly lit, since there was no sun coming through the huge windows. The entire building was basically a big metal cocoon at the moment. Eri? Twirl? Izuku called out in a whisper yell as he advanced slowly. The space was quiet and still, but something felt off. Eri? Twirl, he tried again, only louder. It's Midoriya? Gestalt. Let's kill him, a voice nearly shouted from the other side of the living room. The same voice then answered back, no. Let's buy him lunch. Sure, another voice said. We can't kill him, Staney said he's good. Staney? I've been wanting to talk to you more, Midoriya Izuku, the same voice said, sounding excited. Two figures stepped into the open from a shadowy corner. A man dressed in a black and gray one-piece costume that Izuku recognized as Twice and a girl in a school uniform who he knew was Toga Himiko. The man could make scarily accurate doubles of people, right down to their quirk, but the doubles were relatively delicate and could be destroyed easily. The girl could also make doubles of others, but she morphed her own body by ingesting their blood. Where are Eri and Twirl? Izuku asked them, standing in a stance that would allow him to move quickly. Toga said, acting coy. We came up here to find the girl, but she wasn't here. You're Toga and Twice, with the League of Villains, Izuku said. What do you want with Eri? You remember me. I knew it. I knew you were special. Well, I'm sure the girl will be useful, but the point isn't what we want with her, it's that we want to punish Overhaul, Toga said, producing a knife from somewhere Izuku hadn't noticed and waving it as if it was an extension of her hand. He killed Magnanizan. There was a glint of malice in her eyes as she said it, and Izuku thought she was probably telling the truth. He was pretty sure he knew which of the League Magna was from the reports after the training camp disaster, but he hadn't heard about their death. Maybe it was recent? He's gotta pay. Twice declared. Then in a different tone, but he's scary. Izuku realized that he might be dealing with a split personality, and that was a little outside his skill set. If Eri is the most important person to him, then I don't think he should get to have her, do you? Not after what he did to Naze. Izuku had to admit he agreed on that, at least. Who are all of these guys in the tower? Is the league that big? Izuku asked, eyes flicking between the two league members. The last intel he'd heard was that the league was a small, elite group of villains that were working to recruit new members and make a bigger name for themselves. He was also surprised to see Toga, who had been seriously injured the last time he'd seen her. Monoma had used Shigaraki's quirk on her when he'd shoved her away at Kamino, but she appeared to be whole now. The league? Nah, Twice said, waving a hand negligently. Overhaul's group wants to use us, so we were sent in to observe. These are all those dumb Yakuza guys. Izuku wondered about how helpful they were being by telling him their plan. Buzz off. Twice told Izuku immediately after that. We ain't tellin' young nothin'. It's none of your business. Shiggy said we should kill you if you showed up, but you don't have to worry about us, Toga told him in a syrupy voice. If Stain said you're a real hero, then we can't do that. We can only kill the bad heroes. Okay, but I can't let you just come in here and take the girl, Izuku told them. It's my job to protect her and everyone else in this building. Including us? Twice asked in a hopeful voice. Then, of course not, stupid. We're villains. How'd you get in here? Izuku asked, trying to ignore the pain of the wound in his side and the burgeoning headache forming from dealing with the crazy events that were unfolding. I can be anyone, Toga said proudly. With just a little drop of blood. She didn't reveal who she had impersonated, but that was a secondary concern at the moment. But now the reason you came here is gone, so, shouldn't you leave? Things are probably going to get pretty ugly very soon, Izuku suggested. At least one of them seemed to be of conflicting opinions, so maybe? It was a long shot, but these people weren't exactly sane. If he could get them to just give up and leave, that would be a whole lot less to have to worry about. Or we could stay and help you, Toga said brightly. I've been wanting to spend more time with you. I know all about your quirk, Izuku-kun. You can get quirks from people you kill. I don't kill, Izuku said, then he had a flash of Dr. Suo, who he technically did kill. If I can help it? She nodded sympathetically. I know. It's really too bad. But that's what would make it so great for us to team up. I could kill him for you. It's a win-win. Twice agreed. Don't listen to her. I don't want anyone to die, Izuku reiterated. But you could get their quirks. Toga argued as if it made perfect sense. You could be the strongest ever. Maybe even more than Sensei. I can do that without killing, Izuku said, feeling gross even being compared to All for One. He was wasting time. He had to find a way to subdue these two or convince them to leave. He had no idea where Eri was, and the bank of screens that normally showed video feeds of the city was only displaying static, so there were probably no transmissions getting in or out. Whether that was because of the lockdown, or something the villains had done didn't matter, the result was the same, no contact. With anyone else. You want to help me and punish Overhaul for what he did to your friend? Izuku tried. You could help by taking out as many of his men as you can. Not kill them, but maybe knock them out or something? That sounds fun, Twice said, clapping his hands. No, it doesn't. Why should we do all the work? I'll be doing the same thing too, Izuku pointed out. We're supposed to bring the girl to Shigaraki, Toga said, sounding torn. But your idea sounds like more fun. Think of all the blood I can collect. Let's go Twice. Izuku blinked at her easy capitulation and watched as the two moved to the elevator doors that led down to the rest of the building. Isn't that blocked off? Izuku asked as he watched them pry open the doors. He made a mental note to tell Sir that the elevator doors should also have rolling steel shutters in a lockdown. It was, Twice said. No, it wasn't. Mimic made us a hole to move through. Toga said. See you soon, Izuku-kun. The two dropped into the elevator, and Izuku hoped that would be the last he saw of them for a long, long time. Once they were gone, Izuku hurried to check the entire floor for signs of Eri and Twirl, becoming more and more frustrated when he couldn't find them. Even the kitten was missing. Did Overhaul's group already have Eri? Did Twirl manage to get her away to safety? Izuku fought off the feeling of panic trying to envelop her as he went back to the door. He could use the override code to get back out, then let himself fall back down to the floor the meeting had been on. Sir and All Might would have a better idea of this building's defenses and what he should do next. The override panel thankfully let Izuku out again, and he was surprised, though he probably shouldn't have been, to see Kaken on the roof. The bigger surprise was that he was holding a tearful Eri in his arms, who was clutching her purple blanket and her kitten. How? Izuku asked. Where's? The grim look that Kaken gave him, along with a sharp shake of his head, told him that he shouldn't ask about Twirl. At least, not in front of Eri. Izuku prayed he didn't suddenly have a spinning force field quirk. Maybe Twirl had been too far out of range when she met her end? I followed you up here after helping blast a hole in the floor for everyone to get through, Kaken said. Eri was hidden up here inside one of those huge tractor tires All Might made us flip all over the roof. I heard the cat and found him. Ms. Twirl told me to stay there while she went to get help, Eri said tremulously. You did good, Eri, Izuku assured her. We're going to make sure you're safe. The only others up here had been Toga and Twice. Had they been the ones to kill Twirl? How had they failed to find Eri? Best way to do that is to get her away from this building, Kaken said. I can't carry her and travel with my blasts at the same time. Izuku had an idea, and held out his arms for Eri. Kaken passed her over immediately. 2 of the League were inside, he told Kaken. Twice, who makes copies of people, and Toga, the shapeshifter. I kinda convinced them to take down as many of Overhaul's men as they could, because they said they were supposed to be working with them, but they don't like it. They jumped down the elevator. No idea if they'll actually do it. Kaken opened his mouth as if to comment, then shut it again with an audible snap. What's your plan? I'm going to take Eri somewhere they won't think to look for her, then I'll come back to help, Izuku said. She's their main goal, so if they can't get her, they lose. Got it? Kaken said. I'll work on taking down the villains here. Don't mess this up, nerd. Izuku nodded with determination and settled Eri so that she was wrapped in her blanket and cradled in his arms. She held tight to the kitten as Izuku began to run for the edge of the roof. He hit the edge with a huge, one-for-all-fueled leap and launched himself out over the city. His foot protested, but didn't fail him as pushed himself skyward. He would have expected Eri to scream or squirm, but she simply buried her face against his chest and put all of her trust in him. It was humbling, and he hoped that his thundering heartbeat didn't tip her off to how terrified he actually was. He cushioned the impact of his landings on rooftops as much as he could but knew they were still uncomfortable for Eri and her kitten. He crossed the city until he found the building that he wanted and hurried inside. He rushed past the reception desk and took the elevator up to the 17th floor, murmuring comforting words to Eri the entire time. When the door slid open, the receptionist looked surprised. I need to see Midoriya Hisashi immediately. I'm his son, and it's an emergency. The receptionist noted his bloodied shirt and the girl, then jumped up from her chair and hurriedly ushered him through a busy office. There was a woman at a desk outside the office who looked up and smiled before she realized the state Izuku was in. What? Is my dad here? Izuku demanded. He didn't wait for her to answer, but opened the door to the office. His dad was seated at this desk, bent over some paperwork. Zu? He said when he looked up from his work. No time to really explain. Villains attacked my tower. The villains are after this little girl. Her name is Eri, and I need you to watch her and not tell anyone she's here. I have to go tell the police about the attack and do what I can to help. He set Eri down on the floor and kneeled in front of her. This is my dad, he said in his calmest, gentlest voice. Eri looked up at the man who seemed to be an adult version of the hero in front of her. Her kitten seemed miraculously unfazed by its flight through the city, and hopped from her arms to investigate the new space. He's great. You can trust him, okay? He's going to make sure you're safe while I'm going to make sure the bad guys go to jail, Izuku told her firmly, but with enthusiasm. His father looked stunned, but Izuku didn't give him any time to question it. I'll be back as soon as I can. Izuku turned and ran out, even as his dad shouted after him. "Why are you bleeding?" "I'm fine," he shouted back over his shoulder without stopping. Instead of taking the elevator to the ground floor, he took it to the top, then found the door to the roof. It was locked, so he simply twisted the handle until it snapped off and hurried to leap off, bounding back to Might Tower in huge leaps. How long had it been now? 20 minutes? He wasn't sure. He pulled out his cell phone and sent a text to Ida and Todoroki to ask them to alert UA and any other available heroes to help at Might Tower. He sent another to let Sir and All Might know that Eri was safely away from the villains and that reinforcements had been sent for. He didn't know if it would reach them, but it was worth a try. When he got back to Might Tower, it was to find the whole block surrounded by emergency vehicles and blocked off. Izuku saw that police were trying to find a way into the building without compromising the hostages' safety. It was a hive of frustrated activity, since the villains apparently had no intention of communicating with the authorities. Izuku spotted Tsukachi and filled him in on who the invaders were, and that they were after a little girl who Izuku had just taken to a remote location. Izuku had no idea if the shy Hasaikai could hear him, so he didn't say where he'd taken Eri. They won't be able to achieve their main objective, Izuku said. "We've already won." "Not yet, we haven't," Endeavor said as he arrived, literally dropping from the air to join them. "That building is still full of people. Do we have any idea how many villains are inside?" Izuku felt chastened by the mild rebuke. Endeavor was right. He told him what he knew about Chisaki being the acting head, and the 8 bullets working under him. Unfortunately, what he knew wasn't very much. He also told them about Twice and Toga and his strange conversation with them. Endeavor promised to help, and told Izuku to seek medical attention. "You shouldn't be here," Endeavor told him flatly. "There could be fatalities." As he said that, a scream tore from a person falling from the building, apparently pushed or thrown from the hole that Izuku had used to escape the building to access the rooftop before. Izuku raced to catch them, but was just a split second too late, having been hampered by Endeavor moving to do the same and knocking into him. The person hit the ground with a sickening squelching sound, obviously dead on impact, eyes staring sightlessly at the sky. A jolt of fear and regret hit Izuku like a brick wall, but that was all. No new quirk immediately made itself known. A split second later, a plague mask landed with a clatter beside the dead man, marking him as one of the villains. Izuku felt sick at the sight of blood pooling under the man's head. Without the plague mask, he looked so ordinary. "Let's get an ID on this guy," Tsukachi told his men, shaking his head in disgust. Endeavor was watching Izuku carefully, but didn't comment when Izuku stumbled to the curb and vomited in the gutter. Izuku felt better after emptying his stomach, which had been twisting with nerves since he'd opened the conference room door to chaos. He wiped his mouth with the back of his gloved hand and turned back to Endeavor. "I can get you inside through the roof," he said. "I can override the security lock there, but there's a separate elevator to the lower floors from there, and we might be able to use that to travel down into the building." "There's no we in this," Endeavor told him with a grunt. "Give me the code and then get back to school and have the old lady patch you up. It requires my palm print along with the code. The door will relock itself after 5 seconds. Ding it. Don't blame me if you end up with a bunch of quirks you don't want or can't handle," Endeavor growled at him. "Hold it," Tsukachi said. "Take a couple of my men with you. The more eyes we have on the inside, the better." He quickly called over 2 of his officers wearing SWAT gear, and Endeavor scowled as he grabbed each of them by the back of their vests and ascended quickly toward the roof in a white-hot burst of flame. Izuku kicked off of the ground and beat them there by only a second, and rushed over to the panel by the door. Final override access granted. The door will relock in 5, 4, 3. "Final?" Izuku asked. "CRP." The shutters rolled away, and the door unlocked, allowing Endeavor to shove the 2 officers through before himself. Izuku managed to slide in, even though Endeavor tried half-heartedly to block him at the last second, and then they were closed in with an ominous sounding clank as the door sealed itself, probably for the final time. They did a quick sweep of the entire floor for intruders before going to the elevator, which was still partially jammed open from Toga and Twice earlier descent. Keep in mind that there is a shapeshifter and someone who can make duplicates of pretty much anyone loose in the tower too, Izuku told them as Endeavor forced the elevator doors wide and basically welded them open with his flames. The two officers nodded and began to descend the weirdly twisted elevator with caution. One of their people can possess objects and manipulate them, Izuku said when they exclaimed in dismay at the distorted space. I don't know how big of a space they can control. Or if they have to stay merged with it to keep it like this, or if there's a time limit, even. If he had to stay merged, then there was a real worry that they could distort again at any moment, or that they could see and hear pretty much anything going on. I could probably force my way through with my fists or feet, Izuku said, but we'd lose any element of surprise. I'm here to do my job, Endeavor told him coldly. Not babysit. I'll handle what I need to. You should do the same. Try not to get killed. With that, Endeavor dropped into the elevator after the two officers, the glow of his flames casting strange shadows as he disappeared from sight. Izuku waited a minute for them to make downward progress, then dropped into the hole himself. Keeping in mind what he knew about the 8 bullets and what Sir had told him earlier about a weakness in the floor and ceiling of each floor, he went in search of a way to help free the hostages, knowing that Eri was safe, but no one else was. Finding the bottom floors wasn't all that hard. The elevator was a strange maze of improbable angles and tight spaces, but Izuku was small and agile, and had no problem slipping through. There were signs of Endeavor's passage through in the temperature of the surfaces Izuku moved through, and the bits of metal that had been melted and bent to make small spaces large enough for his frame. It was also easy to see where he had decided he'd had enough of the elevator and had half-forced, half-melted a hole in what had once been doors leading out to another floor. Izuku was careful not to get burned by the still soft, heated metal as he moved through to the floor with the sidekicks' dormitories on it. He wasn't sure where Endeavor had gone from here to maybe the stairs? Sir had said he would work on getting access to the stairwells. Izuku was willing to bet there would be plenty of villains to face there, but not many civilians. If there was a weakness in the floor and the ceiling of each floor, Izuku assumed it would be in a place that could easily be smashed through by someone of All Might's caliber of strength, probably in a straight line from the top to the ground floor. So in an emergency, All Might could simply make his own way out, or through, the building. Since the elevator could serve the same sort of purpose, it was logical to conclude that that pathway would be set on the opposite side of the building, in case the bank of elevators wasn't a viable option. They would also be places in areas where it would be unlikely anyone would be injured if All Might suddenly burst through the floor or ceiling on his way through. Izuku zipped around the floor, looking for any place that might serve that purpose, and finally found it. A small, tiled space on the floor, with a decorative table and a large potted plant taking up most of the space. At first glance, it seemed like just an interior design element, giving some greenery to an otherwise mundane space, but the placement was a bit strange. Izuku tried to think of other floors on the building, and whether or not there were similar areas on the other floors, and he thought there just might be. It was worth a try, and if he was wrong, he'd have to find a way to help pay for any damage he was about to cause. He moved the plant off of the tile, not wanting to kill it if it could be saved. He let his levitation take him to the ceiling, where he braced his back against the tiles and extended his arms out. Grabbing the wrist of his left arm, he locked his elbow and braced as he prepared to use his Air Force move, using his thumb and middle finger to flick with all of the 35% of one for all he could put behind it. He felt the tiles under his back cave as the impact of the wind hit the floor, causing it to cave downward. True to his suspicion, there were no steel beams or load-bearing columns to impede the way, and the tiled area crashed down through the next floor's ceiling, causing a plume of chalky dust. Izuku waited a moment to see if anyone would shout, or shoot, or otherwise come up through the hole he'd just made. Nothing happened, so Izuku dropped through the hole he'd made and searched the floor for any sign of trouble or civilians. He found neither, though a few of the doors were locked. He called through the doors that if there was anyone in there, they should stay put and stay safe until the danger was past. Then he repeated the same thing again and again. Each floor he broke through, using Air Forcer shoot styler just straight-up punches. It wasn't easy on his body, since he wasn't in his hero costume, but it was manageable. When he found civilians, he told them to stay locked up where they were until the danger was past. It wasn't until he'd searched 7 floors that he actually ran into any type of resistance. Izuku skidded to a stop as he came face to face with a man with a burlap sack over his head. There was a mouth stitched into a smile, and round eye holes cut into it to fashion a mask, and though his clothing was completely normal, the whole effect was unsettling. "So hungry," the figure said after spotting Izuku. "I can tell," Izuku told him, eyeing him warily, spooked at how the food quirk was jangling inside of him, unable to pinpoint any one food the man wanted to eat. Normally his quirk would have told him exactly what this man was hungry for, but there was some indefinable air about him that said he'd be happy to eat literally anything. It didn't even matter if it was supposed to be food. "Are you one of Overhaul's men?" he tried, hoping the man felt talkative. So hungry," the man ummed, heading toward Izuku with his arms stretched out as if to make a grab for him. Eat. His speed was impressive, but no match for Izuku's own. Every time the man lunged for him, Izuku evaded easily, and they played a brief game of cat and mouse until Izuku used his Air Force move to send the man flying backward into a wall. It should have been enough to knock the man out, but he was getting to his feet as Izuku prepared to rush the man and try to knock him unconscious. He was just beginning to lunge when a white blur streaked past, and the scarecrow-like visage was suddenly wrapped in Aizawa's capture weapon. The cloth straps were wound with precise placement to keep clear of the suspect's mouth, but still incapacitate him. "Sorry, this one got past me while I was dealing with another one. Sun Eater took care of 2 others in the stairwell," his teacher said. "Why aren't you with Eri? How do I know you're not Toga or a copy twice made?" Izuku asked in the way of an answer. Izuku stared at Aizawa with suspicion. Had they mentioned Eri's name in the meeting? "I know about One for All," Aizawa told him, sounding approving. That was good enough for Izuku. "I took her someplace else," Izuku said vaguely. "She isn't in Might Tower anymore." Aizawa nodded. "There's a situation further down and I'm going to need to get down there." "How are you feeling?" Aizawa said. "There have been some casualties." "I know," Izuku said, thinking of Twirl and the shy Hasaikai man who'd fallen to his death outside. "So far, I'm fine. If I picked up any new quirks, I don't know what they are yet. I feel normal. Your arms are black and blue, and I'm pretty sure you've got some broken fingers," Aizawa told him after a quick observation. "Plus you're soaked in blood. Is that someone else's?" Izuku looked down at his shirt. "No, it's mine. When they broke into the conference room, one of them shot at me. I think they were trying to shoot me with one of those quirk-canceling ones they shot Sun Eater with the other day, but all of my quirks are, oh. Maybe the bullet you got hit with only erased your base quirk," Aizawa said thoughtfully. "Which means that until it wears off, you won't inherit any new quirks?" That idea was sort of liberating. Izuku didn't have to worry for at least a few hours about gaining any unwanted quirks. Aizawa looked over at the man he'd been holding captive and saw that he was no longer struggling. He seemed to have passed out, possibly from lack of air. Izuku helped his teacher secure the man that Aizawa called Tabe. They made sure he was tied to a chair, since the man could apparently chew through and consume almost any substance. "What's going on down below?" Izuku asked as Aizawa headed back toward the stairwell. "The upper floors are clear as far as I can tell. Some employees following lockdown protocol, but no villains." "Hostage situation," Aizawa said grimly. "Overhaul says he'll kill one person every 5 minutes until Eri is brought to him." "Holy shit. It's been at least an hour since they first," Izuku said, feeling panic surge. "Calm down. He's only killed 2 so far," Aizawa said in a hard voice. That was before the heroes knew what was going on. "There are people down there with quirks to keep Overhaul from touching anyone, and as long as they hold out, this whole thing is at a standoff. From what I hear, even if he changes the landscape, the hostages are safe. Is there a plan?" Izuku asked, noting that the stairwells seemed to be clear now. "We've been whittling down Overhaul's men. We've taken down at least 3 of the 8 bullets, and at least a dozen of their underlings," Aizawa reported. "One of the 8 got tossed out of the 5th floor window and died on impact," Izuku said, slim build, light hair, black plague mask. He wrestled with the fresh mental image and forced himself to stay calm and objective. There would be time to fall apart later. Hopefully. That would have been Setsuna Toya, Aizawa informed him. "I don't know who took him out, though. So that makes 4 of the 8, Overhaul is keeping Chronostasis and Nemoto Shin close to him, down with the hostages. Fat Gum, Red Riot and Sun Eater were all fighting their way up the stairwell ahead of me, trying to reach Eri. Lemillion got hit with a quirk-canceling bullet, but still went with them. Several others are also searching the building from different directions. Maybe they'll run into the other three. Why aren't you down there, using your quirk on Overhaul? Izuku asked curiously. I can't stare at him for hours without blinking, he said with a shrug. I can be more useful up here for now. Have you run into Endeavor? Izuku asked. He's down with the hostages, helping keep Overhaul at bay, Aizawa said. All might and sir? Izuku asked as they traveled downward. They were working on a way to get all of the employees who aren't active hostages out of the building. The 8 Bullets job was apparently to gather up as many people as they could and bring them down to the first floor to be held as ransom for Eri. The rest of us are working to keep that from happening. Rocklock has the stairway to the first floor sealed off from the upper floors with desks and tables he locked to the walls and floor. I can help get people out, Izuku said immediately. There are hundreds of employees that work here. They're going to need lots of help. Go ahead, kid, he told his student. Mimic's been taken down, so the walls shouldn't be changing around anymore, unless Overhaul lets loose. Izuku nodded and sprinted ahead, jumping down flights of stairs where he could to reach the second floor. He knew immediately when he reached the right place, because it was packed with people. Most were sitting quietly on the floor, leaving paths to walk down hallways. There were open office doors that Izuku could see were filled with frightened people as he walked through. All might? He asked when he spotted Centipeter moving around, patrolling the area and offering bottles of water and quiet words of comfort. Centipeter pointed to the end of the hallway, in the direction that Izuku was already moving. Izuku nodded his thanks and kept moving. At the end of the hall was a small conference room, where Sir All Might, Bubble Girl and a couple of the heroes that had been injured by quirk-canceling bullets in the initial attack were holed up. Ryukyu had a bandage around her arm, and Uraraka and Tsuyu were standing nearby, watching events unfold. Kaken was there as well, looking angry and arguing that they should just let him blow a hole in the wall and get the civilians out that way. I've already told you a dozen times, that will attract too much attention. We can't afford to draw attention to this many people basically over their heads. It would be a simple matter for Overhaul to rebuild this portion of the building. There's no way to get this many people out quickly enough to escape notice. Izuku could see the frustration in Kaken's expression. Gestalt, Sir said when he spotted Izuku. What can you report? I took Eri to another part of the city and left her with someone I trust, Izuku said, knowing that Kaken would have already told them that. Then I came back here, talked to Endeavor and the police, and used the override to let him and a couple of SWAT members in. I don't think the override will work for me again. Sir confirmed that 3 times was the maximum with his code, though All Might had unlimited access, of course, but he was the only one. You're injured, my boy, All Might said with concern. Uraraka looked at him sharply and grabbed a first aid kit with the clear intent to tend to Izuku's wounds. I got shot when they first broke in, Izuku said, looking down at the dried blood on his shirt. It seems pretty superficial, it's not even bleeding anymore. Uraraka nudged his hands away and lifted his shirt to show a small hole in his side that seemed to have exited a few centimeters away. The area was red and bruised, but otherwise didn't look too bad. But your quirks still work? All Might asked with surprise. All but one, Izuku said with a grim nod. It seems like they've cancelled out inheritance, at least temporarily. Uraraka went to put bandages on Izuku's wounds, but quickly discovered that the tape wouldn't stick. He gave her a rueful look and a slight shrug. Small mercies, Sir muttered. You and Bakugu are just the team we need. That got both young men's attention. Sir quickly told them his plan, and everyone nodded in determination. It was simple, solid, and most of all, it was easy. Izuku and Kaken hurried back through the second floor and to the stairwell, where they silently made their way upward. They ran into Sun Eater and Lemillion, who were looking tired and a bit beat up, but were up and moving. They quickly told him the plan, and they agreed to go down to the second floor to help organize. Izuku and Kaken kept moving, stopping to explain to a couple of other heroes that they needed to go to each floor and find any locked-down employees and get them ready to be evacuated. It took some time to reach the top of the lower floors, but then they felt free to make as much noise as they needed. They blew a hole through the ceiling to get to the upper floors and immediately parted ways. Kaken was heading to UA, and Izuku dropped to the ground to relay to the police what was about to happen. Tsukachi listened, then sprang into action, putting in calls and directing his men. Izuku made sure everything was clear, then jumped back up to the hole in the 5th floor, and back into the building. It was there that he ran into Toga and Twice again. "Midoriya-kun," Toga exclaimed with glee when she saw Izuku appear. "Did you get some new quirks? We killed a whole bunch of Overhaul's guys, so you should be super powered now." "Those guys were wimps," Twice said with a nod. "They broke so easily." Izuku did not need to have to fight these two, and sighed inwardly. "I told you not to," he began. "You're not the boss of us," Twice shouted. "We do what we want." "What's your range?" Toga asked excitedly. "Did you get all of them?" "So many quirks. Overhaul's men shot me with a quirk-canceling bullet, so I can't get any new quirks right now," Izuku confessed, hoping it would make them stop murdering people. "Those beasts," Twice said. Then he pointed at Izuku and shouted, "Eith." Anyway, Izuku told them while Toga stuck out her lower lip in a pout, "All of the heroes in the building are about to come through here checking every floor." "They already came through," Toga said. "It's so easy to hide here. This time they've got people with quirks that will help them find everyone," Izuku said, trying to sound convincing. "If you have a way to get out of here, you should probably go before they catch you." "Why aren't you trying to catch us?" Toga asked. "Didn't you say you were going to help me?" Izuku asked. "Wouldn't it be pretty bad if I just attacked you after you agreed to work with me?" "You are a hero," Twice exclaimed. "Scumbag. I'll have to try to arrest you the next time, though," Izuku told them. "Yay," Toga said, clapping her hands happily. "I can't wait." Izuku had to struggle to keep his face expressionless. "You only have a few minutes," Izuku told them. "The others won't hesitate to arrest you." Izuku hoped they took his advice, so they didn't have to deal with 2 more psychopaths on top of everything else. Normally, he would stand and fight, but they were kind of in the middle of something a lot bigger. He hoped he wouldn't be in trouble for this later. "Got it?" Toga said, giving him a flirty wave. "Until next time, Izu-chan." Izuku tried not to react in any way as turned and hurried from the room. He had a feeling that Toga and Twice wouldn't leave while he was watching them, and he didn't have time to waste. He sped to the 2nd floor, where all of the people were being divided into 2 groups. Izuku quickly relayed that all of the plans for Tsukachi were underway, and he privately filled in Sir and All Might about Toga and Twice, just in case they hadn't left after all. Both looked concerned, but agreed that he'd done the best thing under the circumstances. "Let's set this plan into motion," Sir said once they were ready to move. "I don't like being this close to the 1st floor with this many people." Lemillion, Sun Eater and Bubble Girl took charge of one group of people who were apparently just waiting for a signal, and they all walked quietly and mostly calmly in a single file line out of the hall and toward the stairwell. Izuku watched as they moved to start climbing, but stayed behind with the 2nd group. When the 1st group was clear, All Might, Centipeder, Sir and Rapid Fire each assisted an injured hero that Uraraka had used her quirk on, though the remaining ones could walk without help. Izuku agreed to lead the way while the able-bodied heroes brought up the rear. Like the group before them, everyone was quiet and calm as they walked single file into the stairwell, following Izuku and the others up the steps toward the 5th floor. He noticed that a few were holding hands in support of each other. If luck was on their side, Tsukachi had used the time wisely, and Kaken had made it to UA by now. It would take the 1st group quite a while to travel all the way up to the roof, which is why only the fittest and youngest employees had been placed in that one. The group Izuku was leading were all older, or less fit, and wouldn't have been able to make such a long journey. At the 5th floor, Izuku was relieved to find that Toga and Twice were nowhere to be seen. Izuku went to the hole he had made in the hallway earlier and looked down below. To his relief, he could see a figure in a UA uniform below with a very distinctive red and white head. "The cavalry's here," he told All Might and Sir. I can see Todoroki down there. But let's try to make this fast. Go down and see if he can do what we need him to, Sir said. The sooner, the better. Izuku hopped out the window and let himself plummet a bit before engaging his levitation and landing in the street. He jogged over to where Todoroki was, noting that Midnight had come along as well. Midnight was holding the case with Izuku's class number on it, meaning he now had a hero costume. He might not be able to fully suit up, but it was something at least. Hopefully they wouldn't lose any more people before this was over. Izuku outlined what Sir and All Might needed for Todoroki to do as he dressed in his auxiliary gear, leaving the main suit in the case. He was glad the building's lockdown protocols kept anyone inside from seeing out, so they would be shielded from view as they worked. He hoped that it was also well insulated inside, or else the cold might give something away. Either way, this was the fastest solution to evacuating a lot of people quickly. As requested, there was a line of buses beginning to pull up along the curb of the closed-off street, opening their doors and waiting. Policemen with clipboards were on standby to take the names of any of the evacuated, to make sure that everyone got accounted for as they left the building. Everything seemed to be in place. Izuku led Todoroki to the section of the building with the hole in the side, and Todoroki sized it up before nodding and extending his right hand. Within a few moments, he had layered ice upward to the hole, then gradually lower to create a huge slide that curved slightly to send anyone who used it down a short length of the street, where there was plenty of room. Izuku traveled back up to the hole and made sure it was safe and stable, with no sharp edges. He sat on the ice, grimacing at the cold and wishing for his full hero costume as he allowed gravity to pull him downward. The ride was a bit bumpy, but not too jarring. The seat of his breaths were wet and cold by the time he skidded to a stop, and he allowed Todoroki to help him to his feet when he reached the bottom. Great job, Izuku told him with a smile. This is a huge help. He turned and gave a thumbs up to All Might and Sir, then stood back so the police could take care of finishing the evacuation. The people would be sent down one at a time, helped up, their names taken, and then they would be allowed to board one of the buses. When the bus was full, it would take the employees to a nearby convention center where they could receive any assistance they needed to get home. At almost the same time as the second person was boarding the bus, the first group of people who had traveled up to the roof were brought down to the ground in what Izuku imagined was a terrifying ride in one of Yurashi's wind bubbles. There were about a dozen people huddled together as he stood in the middle of them as if on solid ground, ferrying them from the roof to the street where police were waiting to direct them. Yurashi saluted and rocketed back up to the roof to get the next group of people. Izuku, relieved that the evacuation was going so smoothly, let out a small sigh and then launched himself up with a jump and his levitation, going all the way to the roof. He knew that getting these people to safety was only the first hurdle. There were still at least 3 madmen in the building's lobby, holding dozens of people hostage. Even if they were at a standstill with the heroes already in there, anything could happen at any moment to change that. That was why he was so relieved to see Hananuki and Kaibara from 1B on the roof with Kaken, trying to keep everyone calm before they were taken by Yurashi down to the ground. Hananuki, Tsubaraba Izuku said with a welcoming smile. I'm so glad to see you. Did Kaken fill you in on what we want to happen? He did. It's a pretty brilliant idea, but it's risky too. Bakugo said the villains always wear masks. That might foil the plan right there, Hananuki said. I think it's better to try than to leave things the way they are, Izuku said. Even if it comes down to a battle, at least the civilians should be safe enough, Izuku said with more confidence than he felt. Once all of these people get to safety, we'll go back down to the street and get started. The evacuation took a lot less time than Izuku imagined, and soon the group of heroes from the roof was down on the street watching the last of the buses pull away, taking employees to safety. Tsubaraba was taking deep breaths, getting ready for his part in the unfolding plan. All Might kept a hand on the boy's shoulder, giving last words of encouragement as Hananuki checked to see if Midnight was ready for her part. All of the able-bodied heroes that were left standing and ready to fight were lined up at intervals around the building, waiting for the signal. The tension in the air was almost palpable as Hananuki knelt on the ground and touched a spot on the security shutters that Sir pointed out to him. The police had been using infrared heat scanners to monitor where everyone was, and planned accordingly. Nanuki then nodded to Midnight, who came forward and ripped the sleeves of her hero costume away. Everyone backed up so that her quirk wouldn't affect them while she shoved her arms through the wall of steel and glass. She turned her head to keep it from becoming submerged in the softened wall, and her face looked flushed from her efforts to expel as much of her quirk's fragrance into the room where the hostages were being held. Tsukachi's men assured her that her arms had penetrated into an area behind a crowd of hostages, and should be well hidden from Overhaul and chronostasis. "I don't know if it's doing any good," she grunted, a sheen of sweat on her face. "Maybe I should just go completely in and strip as much as I can? Anyone have some of those quirk enhancers?" One of the officers half-joked nervously. "That'd come in handy about now." "He's not wrong," Midnight said, sounding serious. "Not an option," Sir said firmly. "If you don't think you can do it, then we'd be best off letting Tsubaraba put the hostages in a force field and just forcing our way in." "The people in close proximity to Midnight are beginning to drop," the officer reported, keeping an eye on the screen of his device. "It's getting the attention of others in the room. If they don't all go down fast, Overhaul and his cronies are going to become suspicious," All Might said with a frown. Izuku said, pinching his bottom lip in thought. "I could use air forcito blow them through the softened windows and force them outside of the building. But that might cause even more trouble if we can't keep him contained." Izuku wasn't really speaking to anyone in particular. Rather, he was quietly brainstorming ways he could help the situation. If we got him out into the open, he could use his quirk to alter the landscape, but if Eraserhead stopped him, we could take him into custody before he could hurt anyone else. Chronostasis isn't a match for this number of heroes, since he can really only affect 1 or 2 people with his quirk at a time. Nemoto's not strong either. On the other hand, is keeping the fight contained inside the building any better? He could bring the whole building down, or change it into anything he wanted, really? "Overhaul is moving," the officer said. "Midnight, get out of there," Sir said tersely. "Mudman, harden the wall." All Might helped Midnight slide her arms out of the wall, and offered her his jacket. "Sorry," she apologized, looking fatigued. "That lobby has tall ceilings. I couldn't emit enough to make a difference. Some of them are getting a nice nap, instead of a stress-filled hostage situation," Hananuki offered awkwardly. Sir was standing near the officer monitoring the heat signatures inside, his brow furrowed. "We need to move quickly. Overhaul is making agitated movements. It won't be long before he loses patience altogether," Sir told them all. "Izuku's idea is a solid one. Find Eraserhead and prepare to engage." "Wait, what? My plan?" Izuku asked. His mind was racing with possibilities, and it took him a moment to recall what he'd been muttering about earlier. "Mudman will soften the wall here and on the other side of the building. Gestalt and Tsubaraba will go through the wall on this side as quickly as possible. Gestalt will use air forcito blow Overhaul, Nemoto and Chronostasis out of the building. Aizawa will lock onto Overhaul while the police move in to contain him. Tsubaraba will do his best to shield the hostages from being blown out, but his abilities are limited in such a large space. We'll have to rely on the quick thinking of the heroes inside to adapt, and the ones out here to act in tandem to protect and evacuate." Izuku wasn't sure how he felt about this. Was his idea really good enough? He felt the weight of the others' eyes on him, but none of them looked judgmental, just determined. "The rest of us will be on the other side, making sure the villains don't get away, should anything go wrong. Tempest, maybe you should head over to the other side to make an ice shield to protect the buildings around us, if you can. If things don't go as planned, we don't want them attacking another building to get more hostages," All Might told Todoroki. "Those buildings should be evacuated by now," Tsukachi told him. "But keeping property damage to a minimum would be appreciated." Todoroki moved off to do his part, and Izuku steeled himself for his own. There were people scurrying everywhere to get into position. Izuku flexed his fingers inside of his costume glove and noted that while they were really bruised, none of them felt broken. At the back of his mind, he was already wincing at the scolding he was sure to get from Recovery Girl when this was over. Still, all he really needed was one good shot with air forcito finish his part in all of this. It was almost over. Tsubaraba and Izuku stood shoulder to shoulder with each other in front of the wall that Hananuki had softened before he'd gone off to the other side of the building. "Ready?" Tsuburaba asked Izuku quietly. Izuku nodded. I'll wait until you put up the shield before acting. Tsuburaba nodded, took an enormously deep breath, and began to step through the wall. Izuku followed suit, and both of them held their breath as they emerged on the other side of the wall. The scene was pretty much what they expected, having seen the screen of the officer's device showing where all of the heat signatures were. Almost everyone was sitting in a group on the floor, with Endeavor, Rocklock, Fat Gum and Kirishima all standing, along with a couple of other heroes and at least 2 employees, all holding the line between the villains and the hostages. The appearance of 2 figures walking through the wall was very noticeable. Heads swiveled in their direction, but by the time anyone could react, Tsuburaba was already letting out his breath in a steady stream, turning his body to lay down a wide swath of solid air over those on the ground. Once he ran out of breath, he breathed deep again to continue, but Izuku was already letting out his breath and kicking up into the air. He took aim at the 3 villains before using Air Force at full power. It worked exactly as he had hoped in regards to the villains, though a handful of others also got caught in the wind where Tsuburaba's shield didn't quite reach. The heroes had been quick to brace themselves and even quicker to grab the hostages who were being blown away. Izuku had been thrown backward into the wall near the ceiling, which was, thankfully, still solid. He kicked off of the wall and let himself land on the solid air shield, sprinting toward the far wall, where Overhaul, Nemoto and Chronostasis had disappeared from his sight as they passed through it. By the time Izuku made it across the lobby and out through the softened wall of the other side, Overhaul and Chronostasis were surrounded by heroes. Eraserhead's eyes were glowing red as he used his quirk to keep Overhaul from using his quirk to escape. Officers were closing in with the restraints that would hold both villains as they were transported to prison. Nemoto was nowhere to be seen, but the 2 biggest threats seemed to be contained. It happened in the blink of an eye. Chronostasis, with hands held high in the air in apparent surrender, suddenly shot out a lock of his hair toward Aizawa's face, causing him to dodge reflexively and lose eye contact with Overhaul. The arrow of hair penetrated shallowly on his forehead, and Izuku knew that this meant Eraserhead's quirk would be slowed down. Overhaul instantly made a grab for his minion, and all hell broke loose. It was impossible to describe in words the horrible sound it made. The way that Overhaul seemed to absorb Chronostasis into himself, deconstructed himself and his underling and reconstructed into something monstrous. Izuku supposed it resembled a Nomu in a way, with its grotesque size and misshapen body. Neither Overhaul nor Chronostasis had been overly muscular, but this abomination was bulging with muscles and veins that seemed to throb. There was no exposed brain, but there was a beak of sorts in the form of an elaborate-looking plague mask that was lined with viciously long teeth. Bat-like wings formed on its shoulder blades, and Izuku prepared to kick off into the air after it, but flight wasn't Overhaul's first choice of action. His hair was now made up of multiple arrows. He'd merged Chronostasis's quirk with his own body, and apparently with his own quirk. One of the arrows shot out at Hananuki, who was nearby, and the ground exploded into sand, the provisional hero having just narrowly leaped away in time. Suddenly everyone, including Izuku, was dodging arrows shot from the thing that used to be Overhaul's head. One of the heroes that Izuku vaguely knew as Mr. Brave wasn't fast enough, and there were shouts of alarm as the hero was suddenly vaporized into a cloud of blood that rained to the ground in a gory puddle where he'd been standing. The heroes redoubled their efforts to stop the creature while the police retreated to a safer distance. Tsuburaba was breathing out shields as quickly as he could for the police and heroes to shelter behind in between their attempts to hit Overhaul. The restraints they had prepared for 2 regular-sized men would do nothing useful now. Endeavor was blasting flames at the thing, while Tempest tried ice. The ice was deconstructed instantly, but the fire seemed to annoy it. Tempest sucked elements and began trying to use his fire spiral to contain them while Endeavor fed into it, turning it into more of a tornado. Yurashi, whose hero name was Gale, appeared in the air and shouted that he could contain the threat. He sent a narrow tube of wind down the center of the fire tornado and lifted Overhaul into the air. Once clear of the fire and closer to Gale, arrows shot out from all directions like helicopter blades hitting Might Tower and turning the security shutters into steel shrapnel, propelled by the wind straight at Gale at hurricane speeds. Gale's concentration slipped as he suffered multiple hits by jagged pieces of metal. For just long enough, the air stilled and a gun appeared in one of Overhaul's hands. With a loud report, he fired the gun straight at Gale, striking him in the arm that he'd thrown up to shield his face from flying metal. A moment later, Gale was in free fall, and Izuku was leaping up to catch him before he hit the ground. "My quirk," Gale gasped, clutching his arm. "It's not working." "The same happened to me," Sun Eater told him, coming to crouch beside him with a small first aid kit. "It was temporary." Izuku gritted his teeth and prayed that the one he'd been hit with still had some time left in his system. "I'm going up," he said with determination. He aimed as best he could and kicked off the ground. He rocketed toward Overhaul, trying to stay beneath him, where he would have a harder time hitting Izuku with the arrows. He got in a hit that sent Overhaul tumbling in the air, and used to flight with the wings he'd given himself. A shot rang out a moment later, but the bullet wasn't aimed at him, it was aimed at Aizawa, who dodged. The heroes below were scrambling to come up with a containment plan, and Izuku could see he was getting in the way of the long-range fighters. He dropped to the ground to give others a better chance and moved to check on Yurashi. Before he could reach him, however, a hand grabbed him, and a voice growled in his ear. "Where is Eri?" "I took her to my father's office to keep her safe," Izuku said immediately. "Where is it?" the voice demanded. "The Tikko building. 17th floor." Izuku couldn't control what he was saying, even though he was trying with everything inside of him. But why had he answered so easily? It had to be a quirk. Now Eri and his father were both in grave danger. "Did you hear that, boss?" the voice said triumphantly. "Eri is on the 17th floor of the Tikko building." Izuku, seemingly freed from the spell he'd been under, turned and punched the man who had just interrogated him in the face. The man's plague mask crumbled under the impact and his head snapped backward. A moment later, the man was up to his chin in ice. Izuku whipped around to see that Overhaul was flying away from the scene, in the direction of the Tikko building. "No!" Izuku shouted. "He's going after Eri. She's with my dad at his office." Sir immediately pressed his phone to his ear while the heroes gave chase as best they could. Izuku had to give chase now, before Overhaul reached his goal. People scattered in all directions, with all might trying to keep Izuku from blinding following, but failing. Izuku shook off All Might's arm and leapt into the air, letting himself land on the roof of Might Tower just long enough to get a running start for his next leap. He spotted Overhaul, already some distance away, apparently having become accustomed to flight once he started moving. He was fast, and Izuku tried to urge himself forward faster, but was forced to land every couple of blocks to give himself more momentum without letting his levitation take him too high. On one rooftop he tripped over a pipe that was painted the same color as the roof and cartwheeled, his balance keeping him from being injured, but costing him time. He had to backtrack and get another running start to launch himself into the air. His heartbeat was roaring in his ears as he finally reached his father's building. Chronostasis was lying face down near the doorway, unconscious and discarded by Overhaul now that his usefulness was over. Izuku stepped over him and raced down the stairs to the 17th floor. There were frightened people crouching behind or under their desks, and Izuku didn't pause as he ran in the direction of his dad's office. "Izuku!" He whirled around at the sound of his father's voice and found a very different-looking Midoriya Hisashi standing nearby with smoke billowing from his mouth and nose. Izuku's father looked young, and it was hard to comprehend that this was what his father had looked like in his late teens or early 20s. "What the?" Izuku asked. "I'm sorry, Zu." That man showed up and pulled a gun, and grabbed Eri. She tried to run away when he showed up, so I grabbed her, but I couldn't keep a hold of her. "Where are they now?" Izuku demanded urgently. His father pointed to a glass door at the end of the hall that seemed to lead to the outside. "There's a balcony there, where some of the employees go to smoke." Izuku raced for the door and burst out through it so forcefully that he busted through the wall of the balcony and had to engage his levitation to keep from plummeting. He spared a glance below to make sure the debris wasn't endangering anyone before he rotated and glared at Overhaul, who was holding Eri in a punishing grip by her upper arm. The horn on her head was noticeably longer, now. Overhaul had done something to turn off her quirk, maybe the temporary quirk eraser? It's over, Izuku told him angrily. Let Eri go. There's no way you're escaping now. As if to lend credence to his words, sirens wailed as the streets below became clogged with emergency vehicles, and heroes arrived to help. Oh, it's over, Overhaul told Izuku. Over for you. You seem rather attached to Eri, but what will you do if I do this? Izuku reached out to grab a piece of rebar to keep himself steady and pull himself back to the balcony. The few seconds it took him to accomplish that simple act was all it took for Overhaul press a fifth finger to Eri's arm, and he deconstructed her in an instant. Izuku's brain was still trying to process what had happened as the scream of rage and horror broke out of him, scoring his throat until it felt like he'd swallowed broken glass. He felt hot and cold as a shiver skated up his spine and his head began to ache as if he'd been hit by a hammer. He very nearly blacked out. His scream was still echoing in the canyon of buildings down the street when Overhaul spoke. I'm the only one who can fix her, he said, touching his hand to the puddle of gore that had once been a sweet, frightened little girl. Suddenly Eri was whole again, looking dazed and terrified. There was no horn on her forehead anymore, however. Gestalt, Eri whimpered as she hung limply in Overhaul's grip again. You have a horn too? With dawning horror, Izuku lifted his hand and felt a short horn sticking out of the painful spot on his head, and felt his heart skip a beat. Oh. No, he said in denial of the obvious. You're that one, Overhaul growled at Izuku. In contempt. The sickest of all of the infected. You've obviously been shot. The effects must have worn off much sooner than usual. And now you've stolen the one thing I need to cure the whole world. There were heroes at the broken door to the balcony, but there was no room for any of them to come out in the narrow space with half of its wall missing. You're the sick one here, Izuku shouted at him. Using a child like a lab rat. She's worse than useless now, Overhaul spat. He flung Eri over the edge of the balcony and sent her hurtling to the ground below. Izuku dove after her, but was stopped midair as something wrapped tightly around his breathed leg and left him dangling. He looked up at his leg and saw something resembling a tentacle holding him for a moment before a burst of fire flared from above and Izuku's leg came free. He let himself free fall, but it was far too late to save Eri before she hit the ground. Her frail, pale form was still as people rushed to her, and all Izuku could do was fall, too late. I failed. Izuku's mind blanked out, too overwhelmed to function. I broke my promise to keep her safe. The darkness was so close to swallowing him that the only thing that could reach him was All Might's voice, shouting. Don't give up. Float. That demand kicked his instincts into action, and Izuku engaged his levitation enough to soften the impact when he hit the ground. He was sure one of his legs snapped when his balance tried to right his position for landing, so he fell more or less on his feet, but he didn't care. He crawled. He crawled to Eri. I'm sorry. He sobbed as made his way to her still form. I'm so sorry. He heard so many voices shouting and talking around him, but he couldn't understand anything but the need to get to the girl he'd failed to protect. Eri, he said, finally reaching her and pulling himself into the sitting position so that he could see her properly. He didn't deserve the mercy of looking away from those sightless eyes that should have looked accusing, but only looked blank and innocent. He took her hand in his and choked on his tears as he realized that her skin was already going cold to the touch. He finally closed his eyes as his whole body felt twisted in knots, and he began to wail in misery and grief. He didn't know how anything could possibly ever be okay again after this. Why are you sad? Izuku caught his breath and gasped at the sweetest sound he'd ever heard as Eri's little hand slipped from his own and she looked at him with eyes full of concern. Full of life. More than the sound of Eri's voice, but the sight of her little horn, small again, poking out through her hair was something Izuku never thought he'd be so glad to see. He reached up to feel his own forehead and found that the horn that had been there only moments before was now gone. Eri had taken her quirk back, Izuku had rewound her. That BSE has wings again, someone shouted from nearby, even as All Might was falling to his knees beside Izuku and Eri and pulling them both into a tight embrace. Sir was crouching beside them too, looking as though he'd aged 10 years in just the last handful of hours. Eri looked upward, then cowered closer to All Might. Izuku looked to see what she was afraid of and saw that he still had a job to do. Overhaul was in the air again, though the wings he'd constructed for himself this time weren't as large or strong. The loss of the body mass he'd gained from his fusion with chronostasis seemed to have left him with less to work with in creating this form. His body looked almost skeletal, as if he'd used every last bit of available mass to create the wings. "He's not getting away," Izuku swore. He got to his feet, and nearly fell again when he tried to put weight on his leg. All Might's shoulder was steady and comforting under Izuku's hand as he used it to brace himself on. Instead of trying to stand, Izuku pushed up into the air again, intent on bringing the villain down, even though he had no plan. As he got closer to his target, he could see that Overhaul was holding a gun, which he fired at Izuku before they were within a range that would force them into a close-quarters fight. Chisaki tried to aim again, though the flapping of the wings was hampering his efforts. All Izuku cared about at the moment was getting to Overhaul and making sure he paid for what he'd put Eri and everyone else through. The fear, pain and rage that filled him left little room for any other thoughts. Pain lanced through Izuku, and he wondered if he'd been shot in the heart. His vision grayed and his hearing dimmed. He thought maybe he was dying, but he didn't feel like he was losing consciousness or altitude. His mind was still working perfectly. Was this the effect of someone's quirk? "Hey kid," a voice said gruffly. "Looks like you're in a spot of trouble." Izuku found his vision clearing and the pain in his chest easing, but saw that he was no longer levitating over the city, but floating in a void of blackness. There was a man facing him, bald, no eyebrows to speak of, but he did have some scruffy hair on his chin and jaw. There were goggles pushed up on his forehead, and his face was wide with a large, square jaw that gave him an underbite. He seemed to be dressed in leather breeches and jacket, but no shirt, and a bandolier-worn crossbody against his bare chest, though he didn't seem to have a gun. Izuku attempted to ask him who he was. Ask where he was, but whatever was happening kept him from speaking, as if his mouth was glued shut. "I know you've got a lot of questions, kid, but we don't have a lot of time," the man told Izuku. "My name's Daigoro, but my hero name is Lariat. I'm the 5th user of One for All." Izuku's mind spun in circles as he recalled something, a niggling memory trying to force its way to the front of his mind. When it finally blossomed, he wondered how he could have forgotten something so profound. It had been after the sports festival. He'd been taken by Shigaraki and been unconscious for a few minutes. That was when he'd had the vision. Like now, he had been unable to talk or feel anything below his nose. There had been a row of heroes standing in a line like soldiers. He'd recognized Shimura and Nana from the pictures Gran had shown her, but the others had been unfamiliar. Some were shadowy figures unable to be seen, others were sharper in clarity. None of them seemed to see him. He counted them and saw there were 8. He knew immediately that these were the previous holders of One for All. The vestige of All Might was still barely a misty vapor-like shape, but still part of their number. They were all staring straight ahead as if waiting for something. Izuku had followed their line of sight and noticed 2 men facing each other. They both had whitish hair, and it was obvious by their looks that they were related in some way. He watched as the 2 men relived the beurge of quirks and of One for All as All for One forced a quirk on his quirkless brother. How All for One had likened himself to a savior of a lost and leaderless people, and how he'd manipulated masses of people for his own advantage. Izuku sighed as the memories of the vision slotted into place, and he remembered that the first holder had spoken to him. How he had said that he'd wanted to show him more, but that it was too dangerous. But he'd reached out for Izuku and told him that he wasn't alone. That had been when the explosion had occurred that had caused the damage that had prompted Kurogiri to send Izuku back to UA. Now, he was having another vision, but this one was more NTMT than the one before. Except for the end of the last one, he'd merely been a witness to a replay history. The memory of a man long dead. Now one of the vestiges was speaking directly to Izuku, though Izuku couldn't answer him at all. "I don't have a lot of time, kid. You've got to get back to the fight, but you need to know what you're dealing with. You're manifesting my quirk, which is lucky for you, since it's the best one of the lot. It's called Black Whip, and it's coming out now because you're in a desperate situation. I'll bet you were thinking that you needed help to grab hold of something that's too far away, right? Black Whip will make short work of that." Be careful, though. My quirk has been stored up in one for all for a long time, and it's only gotten stronger. Anger'll help fuel it, but it can also make you lose control of it. Keep a cool head and a calm heart, and you'll do just fine. Izuku could see that Daigoro's form was beginning to get fuzzy, and his words were starting to sound as if they were coming from farther away. DMN. Looks like I'm out of time. Heads up, kid. Mine isn't the only quirk that's gonna be coming out, now that you've got a good grip on one for all. Be prepared to deal with the quirks of the other holders too. With those ominous words still echoing in his mind, Izuku was tossed back into reality, not too much higher in the air than where he'd been before. Though the interaction with Daigoro seemed like it had taken longer, it appeared to have taken almost no time at all. Black tendrils of something almost oily-looking were now emanating from his hands, floating on the air around him like ribbons held aloft by a breeze. A cool head and a calm heart, Izuku murmured, repeating the fifth's words. Easier said than done. Rage was still coursing through him, and a kind of grief that had been formed and realized and then reversed, leaving him with emotional whiplash. He had a job to finish. Then he held out his hands toward Overhaul and instead of pulling, he pushed with his thoughts, telling himself that he needed to grab hold and bind, without physically touching the villain. The black ribbons shot forward and looped around Overhaul's body several times, just as a WHP might do if flicked properly. He pulled back on his arms as he might on a fishing pole with a bite on the line, and the black tendrils tightened like wires, clamping Overhaul's arms to his body and his legs tightly to each other. The wings at his back were crushed down like a crumpled umbrella, yet Black Whip seemed to keep its captive suspended in the air, somehow. Black Whip seemed to be made of energy, because Overhaul's fingers grabbed at the bonds repeatedly with no success. His hands scrabbled to grab at the tendrils, but they were immune to his quirk. Still, if Izuku lowered this monster to the ground, everyone there would be in danger again once Black Whip was released. Izuku lowered himself to the ground first, willing the W's holding Overhaul to extend to let him down without lowering his captive. It was like a fishing rod in his mind was allowing him to feed out more line, and he was breathing by the time his good foot hit the ground, but steady. Looks like another new quirk, Tempest said from where he was standing on the sidelines. Just in time, too, another hero agreed from beside him, sounding odd. What happens now? Bubble Girl asked, sounding perplexed. We need to knock him out, Sir said firmly, placing a hand on Izuku's shoulder as if to hold him to the ground. Can we get? But Izuku only heard the first part, and he was only too glad to oblige. He used the quickest way he could think of to knock the villain out. Sir jerked his hand back and stepped out of the way when Izuku swung his arms in an arc and slammed Overhaul into the side of the building. Overhaul seemed to go limp. Izuku wasn't going to trust him. For good measure, he swung his arms in the other direction and slammed the villain into the building across the street. Then he pulled hard in an arc from behind his head toward the front of his feet and brought Black WT down to the street, pounding Overhaul into a parked and abandoned truck. Metal crumbled and the vehicle bounced wildly on tires not designed for such abuse before it settled. He realized he was being brutal, and struggled to rein in the longing for vengeance. He was not a judge and it wasn't his place to sentence Chisaki Kai to an early grave. Swaying on his feet, Izuku released his hold on Black Whip and watched it flicker into nothingness, as if it had never manifested. It felt like the weight of the world had vanished from his shoulders at the same time, leaving him feeling unsteady and exhausted. Sir stepped forward again to anchor him, and All Might rushed over too. Overhaul was a bloody heap a half a block down the road, and not moving. Police were rushing around to quickly and cautiously take him into custody while Endeavor went to ensure that the villain stayed knocked out. Is it over? Izuku asked no one in particular. It's over, Sir affirmed. How are you feeling, my boy? All Might asked, his large hand taking hold of Izuku's arm to shore him up. If you're getting new quirks, then the bullet you got hit with earlier has worn off. It's not, Izuku started. That wasn't. Then he realized that he couldn't really talk openly about it just now. Too many ears and too many secrets abounded to speak freely. Too many complicated thoughts and feelings. Besides, it was true, if he'd gotten Ares' quirk, even if he didn't have it anymore, then the effect of the bullet really had worn off. But that wasn't why he had the newest quirk, and he hardly had the energy to talk about it now. Something weird happened, but we can talk about it later. In private, he said instead, hoping it was quiet enough for at least a little privacy. How is Eri? Aizawa is riding with her to the hospital, Sir said quietly. She went through quite an ordeal. Physically, she's fine. Izuku felt the knot in his chest tighten again at the memory, but nodded. Her quirk returned to her once I rewound her enough, and that was enough to shut it off, I think. I might be able to help her with it, someday. Uravity was helping the police by making the unconscious form of Overhaul weightless so that they could put the quirk-canceling bonds on him without risking touching his hands, and load him into an armored truck that was acting as an ambulance for the time being. He was still alive, but just barely. Izuku found that he was more or less ambivalent to the villain's condition. Just as things seemed like they would settle down, both of the phones that Izuku kept on him began to ring, each with a different ringtone. One was his father, and one was the Hero Safety Commission. Izuku handed Sir his own phone. Can you let my dad know everything's okay and that it's safe to come out? He has got to be freaking out. Then he answered the other phone, voice rough and quiet. Midoriya, a woman's voice sounded relieved. Can you please translate this? It's a recorded message that's been repeating for the last 5 minutes at the National Diet Building. Izuku listened and his brow furrowed in concern as he translated aloud. The bomb will detonate at 1,500 hours if our demands are not met. Release Benicio Ferreira from Tartarus and give him an unhindered path to Haneda Airport, where he will board our private jet. Any attempts to interfere with his release will be met with carnage. Endeavor heard this and took off at a running start before launching himself into the air. 2 other heroes' phones pinged even as Izuku related that Endeavor was on the way, and they also left in a hurry. We need to get Izuku to Recovery Girl, All Might was saying, while paramedics tried to tend to the young hero's wounds. Tempest, what are you doing here? Izuku asked when he saw his friends standing nearby. I thought you would have gone back to school. Todoroki just shrugged and said, I wanted to know what was going on. Izuku stared at him blankly for a moment before he snorted out a laugh. He hadn't realized how much he needed it until it slipped out, but it helped release some of the pressure that had been building up inside of him all day. The unexpected absurdity of Tempest just showing up at the secondary site because he was curious was just the thing to keep Izuku from falling apart in a bundle of nerves and reaction, now that things were calm again. It's been a long day, Izuku said, feeling like he would sleep for a week after this. It's just barely an hour past lunchtime, Todoroki supplied blandly. You're joking, Izuku groaned. Sir and All Might managed to look a bit sympathetic while still studying Izuku for signs of a breakdown. Eri wasn't the only one to go through an ordeal. Izuku honestly didn't know what was holding him together at this point. You boys should be getting back to you, All Might told them. Midoriya Shonen needs to be treated by Recovery Girl and to rest. Wait, Izuku heard a familiar voice call. He looked over to see his dad approaching, his suit hanging a little more loosely than usual on his suddenly younger body. Dad, Izuku said, unsure how to react. Are you okay? I'm fine. I feel great. It's you I'm worried about, his dad said, the smoke not as prevalent as before. Everyone says that Eri's quirk made me younger, but I still feel like an old man watching his son get tossed around by villains. If you had continued touching her while her quirk was out of control, it's safe to say you could easily have been reverted to your childhood, infancy, or even out of existence with prolonged contact, Sir said honestly. You're very lucky you didn't maintain any more contact than you did. Izuku saw that his father didn't even look shaken by that bit of information because he was so worried about his son. He wondered how long it would take for it to sink in that they looked more like brothers now than father and son. You also did an admirable job of keeping her safe, All Might said. I'm sorry you were caught up in this. You were the safest person I could think of to leave her with, where the villains wouldn't think to look, Izuku told him contritely. And then I ruined it by telling them exactly how to find you both. That wasn't your fault, Sir told him. Nemoto Shin used his confession quirk on you. You couldn't have known. I was just about to explain about him when the invasion began. With that, All Might left Sir to explain things further to Izuku's father, and then drove the boys back to school. Izuku sat in the back seat with his legs across the bench, so as not to jostle them more. All Might didn't stay beyond making sure that Izuku got safely to Recovery Girl's office, then went to take Might Tower out of lockdown mode. Todoroki got called away by Nizu for disappearing when he should have returned to the school, and Izuku didn't envy him the scolding he was probably about to receive. Recovery Girl helped him undress, started in 4-drip to hydrate him, and then kissed him into a welcome, temporary oblivion. Izuku woke to find that he'd slept the rest of the day and all through the night. It was early morning when he sat up and stretched, feeling refreshed and distinctly free of pain. The 4 was gone from his arm, and there were no bandages anywhere on his body, so he took it as a good sign. He slid off of the bed and didn't see Recovery Girl anywhere, but nature was calling, so he took care of his most pressing need in the nurse's bathroom and went back to his bed. He didn't like the idea of putting on his bloody clothes again to go back to his dormitory, so he decided to wait for Recovery Girl to say he was free to go, then text one of his friends to bring him something to wear. Ida was usually up this early. There was a soft clatter by the door, and Izuku looked over to see Recovery Girl pushing a small cart into the room with a tray of food. "Eat breakfast," she said by way of greeting. "You need the nutrition. You have visitors on the way." Izuku accepted the tray and dug in, surprised to see Sir and All Might enter the room a moment later. "How are the others that got sent to the hospital?" Izuku asked immediately. "I don't know," Recovery Girl told him. "I wasn't called in to consult, so I haven't gotten any reports." "They're stable and no one is in danger of dying," Sir said. "We can discuss that in a moment. First, I have a confession to make." Neither Sir nor All Might's faces gave away anything of what they were thinking or feeling. Izuku stopped eating and put down his chopsticks to listen to what they had to say. Instead of speaking though, Sir held up a tiny object that Izuku squinted at, trying to figure out what it was. "I took this from the gun that Overhaul had yesterday. He dropped it when he lost consciousness, and stole one of the bullets before handing the gun over to the police." "You stole?" Izuku asked in surprise. "Why?" A slight blush blossomed over Sir's cheeks, embarrassment making him stiffen and fidget a little. "I thought it might be useful to you," he said. "To me?" Izuku asked, not sure what he meant. "Shonen," All Might said softly. "The gun had quirk-canceling bullets that permanently cancel quirks. The effects aren't temporary. All of his underlings were shooting with temporary ones, but Overhaul, his compound has been searched, is still being searched. We believe Chisaki completed the formula and intended to mass-produce it. The fact that he was the only one to have the permanent ones and didn't use them freely when he was forced into a standoff means he probably only had a limited supply. This is one of those bullets." Sir picked up the explanation from there. "As soon as the bullet impacts something, the needle is exposed, pierces the skin and the serum is injected into the bloodstream. If we were to use it on you, we believe, based on how the temporary selective reaction of the serum you were shot with yesterday affected you, it would permanently shut down inheritance," Izuku finished in awe. "Exactly. Still leaving all of your other quirks intact," Sir said with a nod. "But the choice is obviously yours. You wouldn't have to fear going to hospitals or being in disaster zones," All Might told him. "But it is still a part of you, and that's something that can't be taken lightly. I think I want to use it. The bullet. But first, I have to tell you about what happened yesterday." Izuku went through the entire day with them, explaining why there were holes in between the floors of the top stories of Might Tower. Now, he explained stashing Eri and meeting Toga and Twice and everything else until he got to the part about remembering seeing the vestiges of One for All. "USAWMYM, sir?" All Might asked, looking visibly shaken. Izuku nodded, feeling like he'd somehow intruded on something private just by seeing her. All Might swallowed hard, but then nodded. "And you saw the first?" "She spoke to you?" "Yes, but before. I just remembered about it yesterday when Lariat came to talk to me," Izuku said. "Was that the right terminology? So you recovered a lost memory, and then Lariat appeared and told you about Blackwhip?" Sir asked. "And said you would be getting even more quirks?" "Right, but I don't know what the quirks of the previous holders were. And if I get shot with the bullet and take away inheritance separately and anyone finds out about that, how can we explain even more quirks showing up?" Izuku asked, feeling as if things were out of control. "That's simple," All Might said with a sigh. "We don't tell anyone. I know you don't like lying to people, but these are extenuating circumstances. I knew you were going to say that. Can I at least tell my dad, so he doesn't freak out? Izuku said. Of course, Sir told him immediately. I know that things look like they just got a lot more complicated, but they really haven't. Izuku was about to ask him if he'd gone crazy, when he paused. Was Sir wrong? Izuku had been getting new quirks his whole life, hadn't he? Some had been forced on him without his knowledge, some he'd gained through inheritance, and two he'd taken on willingly with the help of very generous, heroic men. Now he would be gifted just a few more, through One for All. But, in exchange, he didn't have to worry about being near death or dying people, and he didn't have to worry about hastening death in those who were ill or mortally wounded. Was that really a bad trade? Once all of the quirks from the vestiges made themselves known, it would be easy enough to say that Izuku had inherited a quirk that cancelled out inheritance, somehow. What quirks will I be getting? Izuku wanted to know. I'll have to do some research into it, but one should be familiar, at least. Mine, Sir, Shimura Nana, had float. It's not all that different from levitation, so the only difference might be that you gain a better control of how high you go and how easily you can come back down, All Might told him. Everything is going to be okay. Somehow, Izuku was beginning to believe it. We won't have to shoot you, by the way, Recovery Girl added. All three of them startled, having forgotten that she was there. The serum can be extracted into a syringe and injected normally, she said. I would be against this, but to be honest, I can only see advantages to inheritance being disabled. You let me know what you decide, and I'll keep the serum safe until you're ready, one way or the other. They all thanked her, and Izuku asked to be allowed to go to class, to make sure his classmates were okay. Since he was healed, there was no reason for any of them to object. The distraction would do him some good after all of yesterday's trauma. Luckily, a new uniform was readily available from a supply that Recovery Girl kept, to replace the one that had been ruined in his battles, and he didn't need to bother his classmates about it. As he was leaving, he got a text from his father to let him know that he had an appointment with his therapist that evening. Excellent. He had a lot to talk about. The story was all over the school, and Izuku got shouts and waves from students he didn't even know, congratulating him on taking down another big villain. He wasn't sure how to handle the praise, so he just smiled awkwardly and waved. Everyone in his class pelted him with questions as soon as he entered, but he didn't really know what to say. Yesterday had been crazy and frightening and exhilarating and horrifying all at once. He wasn't sure how much he was allowed to say before he spoke to police, if they even really needed to talk to him since they'd been there for the final confrontation and had witnessed everything. It was all over the news, Ciro told him, holding up his phone that had an article that featured a picture of Might Tower in lockdown, looking like a big steel obelisk planted in the middle of the city. Bakugo said not to believe everything you read or see on the news, but wouldn't tell us anything else. Todoroki didn't say much either. Izuku scanned the room and saw that Uraraka and Tsuyu were absent. They went to check on Ryukyu, Todoroki told him when he looked worried. That made sense. Their mentor had been shot by one of the temporary quirk-canceling bullets in the initial attack on the conference room. Of course they'd go and check on her. Any news on the others? He asked. There was a lot of head shaking, and Izuku wondered if he would be forgiven for leaving and going to check on the others himself. He shouldn't go to the hospital though, and if the others were fine, they would also be in class. He settled in his seat and found Kaken looking at him. What? Izuku asked when Kaken didn't say anything. Are you really okay? Kaken finally asked. Recovery Girl thinks so, Izuku said. Physically, at least. I haven't really had time to think about the rest, yet. I just barely woke up an hour ago. I've got an appointment with my therapist later today. That much was true. He'd taken the uniform and had a hasty shower in the nurse's office before dressing and heading to class. He hadn't even stopped at the dormitory. Kaken looked at him as if he was trying to figure something out, but then shrugged and turned to face forward. There was a lot of chatter still, so Izuku stood and asked everyone to take a seat for class. They slipped into their seats as the door slid open, and Midnight walked in. Aizawa-sensei is currently helping with a case, and will be out for the next couple of days. I'll be taking over his homeroom duties for now, she told them. Her usual vivacity was missing, though she was still treating them with a friendly air and calm attitude. Izuku wondered if there was more to Aizawa's absence than she was sharing. It was more than likely that he was still watching over Eri for the time being, making sure her quirk didn't go out of control again. After homeroom, their other teachers seemed to be distracted or crankier than usual, and Izuku wasn't the only one to notice. There weren't any, "oh yeah," comments from present Mike all through English. Ectoplasm was hard to read, but seemed tense through math class, and Cementos kept losing his place while reading in modern literature. It wasn't until lunchtime that any of them got a clue as to why the teachers were acting subdued. There were whispers and a strange atmosphere throughout lunch rush, and Class 1B all looked miserable and wouldn't make eye contact with anyone. Not even Monoma was up to taunting them. It was almost as if someone had died. Izuku nearly dropped his tray as the thought struck him, and his gaze raced over the students in 1B, looking for clues. "Hananuki," Izuku said, seeking out the other boy. "What's going on? Why's everyone?" A few others in the class glared at Izuku, and he automatically felt the need to apologize, but he didn't know what he would be apologizing for. "They didn't tell you about Inesa?" Hananuki asked quietly. Izuku shook his head with dread. Tears were already pricking the backs of his eyes at the thought that Yorashi hadn't survived. He'd been hit in the arm, hadn't he? Had something else happened? "The bullet they shot him with wasn't like the others," Hananuki said sadly. "They say the effect isn't temporary." The tears that had been threatening already at the thought that someone had died spilled over and dripped down Izuku's cheeks. He should have realized. They had told him that the bullets from the gun overhaul had dropped the permanent formulation of the quirk-canceling drag in it. The same gun that he'd used to shoot Yorashi. How had he missed that? "Oh no," was all he could think to say. "We're all in shock," Hananuki said. "Didn't you get shot too?" Tsubaraba asked him from across the table, sounding angry. "I did," Izuku admitted, knowing he couldn't deny what everyone else had seen. "By a different gun with different bullets." "Then why do you still have your quirks? While Inesa? Tsubaraba seemed on the verge of breakdown, and Kendo rushed over to put a comforting hand on his shoulder. Instead of leading him away to help calm him though, she looked at Izuku as if wanting to hear his answer too. The gun's overhaul's underlings had seemed like they only had the temporary quirk-canceling drag bullets in them, he explained. Only overhaul had the permanent kind. That's why I didn't pick up the quirks of everyone who died yesterday. I got shot when they first ambushed us, and he got shot by overhaul later. I'm so sorry. It really did seem unfair that he had so many quirks, and Yorashi had lost the only one he had. It's not your fault, Hananuki told him. Just really bad luck. At least that overhaul guy got what was coming to him, Tetsu growled, stabbing at his lunch viciously. Everyone at the table nodded. I never thought I'd be grateful to the League of Villains, Kaibara added. Wait, what? Izuku asked, feeling lost. You didn't hear? Tetsu asked. The League of Villains ambushed the transport that was taking overhaul to the villain hospital. Kendo nodded. I'm missing something, Izuku said. They cut his arms off, Tsubaraba said with dark satisfaction in his voice. The League of Villains cut off both of his arms and then they just left him there, as good as quirkless? Holy see, was all Izuku could think to say. Is he dead? Nah, Tetsu said as if it didn't matter either way. The driver of the prisoner transport truck called for help as soon as the League showed up, so they were there pretty fast. League was long gone though. Chisaki's critical, but probably gonna make it? Of course, Izuku said sullenly. This is crazy. Tell me about it, Tsubaraba agreed. Look, don't give up hope, Izuku told everyone at the table. We don't know that overhaul didn't make a cure for that bullet. I mean, what if he accidentally shot himself, or got some in his eyes or mouth while making it? Wouldn't he want to be able to reverse it? Plus, think about the money he could make from it. What wouldn't someone pay to get their quirk back if they got shot? That put a speculative look in their eyes and some hope that hadn't been there before. It would be the smart thing to do, Izuku said with a shrug. Thanks, Hananuki told him, sounding grateful. Izuku went to sit at a table with Todoroki, Kaken and Kirishima, but had lost his appetite. He related the news about Yorashi, but Kaken didn't seem surprised. That was probably why he'd been looking at Izuku so closely before homeroom that morning. You knew? He asked. Kaken scowled at him, then nodded shortly. Why didn't tell? What can you do about it? Kakin interrupted him. What's the point in upsetting everyone before they had TB? Izuku opened his mouth to retort, then closed it. In his own way, Kakin had been protecting them. Izuku gave a reluctant nod of acknowledgement. Then, since it was weighing on his mind, he asked Kakin his thoughts on Overhaul having created a cure. It's what I would have done, Kakin answered thoughtfully. Though what are the chances it's not hidden somewhere only he knows about? Just knowing there might be a cure is something at least, Kirishima said. If it exists, we should be able to find it. By we, Izuku hoped he meant the heroes, and not them, personally. He didn't want his friends getting involved in something that dangerous without being sanctioned by their mentors. Lunch ended with Class 1B seeming a little less gloomy than when lunch had started, but Izuku hadn't been able to bring himself to eat. There was a lump in his throat and a tightness in his chest that seemed to be trying to choke him, little by little. Maybe he wasn't handling all of this as well as he thought. He hoped that his therapy session was booked for a long, long visit. Basic hero training was taught by Present Mike, who taught them about the way sound carried and the vibrations it could cause. He challenged them all to move as stealthily as they could to avoid detection by either Jiro or Shoji. It was interesting and useful, but Izuku's mind was too full of the events of yesterday and the implications to really excel at it. Things were in a kind of limbo for a couple of days until Izuku finally decided to permanently disable inheritance. It was done without fuss, with only All Might, Sir, his father, who had brought Aries' kitten with him to be delivered to her, and Recovery Girl there to witness it. There was no sudden reaction or anything to indicate that inheritance was gone, and the only real way to know for sure was to wait and see. Until then, things were just the same as always. Yurashi Inasa came back to school 3 days later. He was quieter than usual, but it was clear that he was trying to keep his chin up. Izuku's heart ached for him, and he told his friend that he felt guilty for having multiple quirks, when Yurashi had been stripped of the only one he had. Yurashi had waved that away and thumped Izuku on the back in a show of friendship, assuring him that he wasn't giving up hope. The school had agreed to let Inasa stay in the hero course, refusing to give credence to the idea that his condition was permanent. He would keep up with his academics and attend hero training, focusing more on battle tactics and hand-to-hand fighting until his quirk was restored. Izuku had to keep up the pretense that he still had inheritance, so he wasn't able to go and visit Eri in the hospital, but that problem was solved a few days after Inasa came back when Aizawa showed up with Eri in the dormitory. She was clutching her surly-looking kitten, and looking shy as she looked around at them all. She'll be living here for the foreseeable future, until she can get a firm hold of her quirk, Aizawa told them all as they gathered around to greet her. You will not be teaching her strange things? His eyes traveled over to Kaminari and Mina when he said that last part. Once she's stable, we can begin quirk counseling and training with her, and hopefully get Inasa back to normal, if we haven't found the cure before then. That made everyone pause and stare at Eri with awe. I can't believe I never even thought of that, Izuku said in amazement, his heart soaring. Brilliant. He hoped he would be able to help with that, though he wasn't sure how he'd even used Wind before. He wanted to try. Things were beginning to look up. The path ahead had cleared a bit. All for One was in prison with no chance of being released. One for All was growing inside of him, and the vestiges were apparently there to guide him. His life would undoubtedly become complicated again sooner rather than later, but that was okay. He had friends, he had his father, and he had teachers to help him every step of the way. They would do it together. What more did he need?